When I was 21 years old, I worked the maintenance and custodial position at the nearby daycare down the block. My job entailed disposing of trash, moving and setting up furniture for special events, performing preventative maintenance, keeping supplies organized, maintaining and cleaning the facility, caring for equipment, and overall maintaining a safe environment, which included reporting suspicious activity that may lead to child abuse or mistreatment. Some days I'd even be the one both opening and closing the facility. It was a pretty demanding job since it was just me and one older guy who was more or less my boss. Most of the time I'd be the one to lock up the place, as he would go home earlier. The daycare building is on the grounds of a Catholic school and church, though I'm pretty sure the daycare was open to anybody, regardless of religion. The older worker, who I'll just refer to as Bob, was leaving early this one day. It must have been a Friday because he always left early on Fridays. He told me the things I needed to get done before cleaning up. Start with the usual clean up the classrooms, and also pack the rest of the Thanksgiving decorations from the classrooms back into the crates, bring them down to the basement, and then start bringing the Christmas crates upstairs. These crates contain decorations that would be used all over the building, from the lobby to the hallways to the classrooms. The childcare staff would be the ones to do the actual decorating, but it was my job to clean up all of it and bring the crates up and downstairs. Since it was now after Thanksgiving, it was time for Christmas decorations to be brought up. All the kids and staff were gone by this point. It was dark out, between 6 and 7 o'clock. I was the only one left in the building, so I locked all the doors while I continued my work. I went down to the basement, which was used mostly for storage. Since it was cold out and we were past outdoor play season, all the outdoor toys that were usually in the courtyard play area were downstairs in the basement. This included but wasn't limited to plastic slides and those toy cars that kids would move themselves in with their feet. The basement consisted of a hallway which passed the boiler room and the hot water heaters, and at the end of the hallway was the storage room. This room always had a creepy vibe to it, mostly because of the lighting, or lack thereof. There was no direct overhead lighting down there. It was just two sketchy dim lights in the corners, and then the small light from the hallway. The basement ceiling also wasn't high. I had to slightly crouch to avoid hitting my head in certain spots. It was like a hybrid of a basement and a crawl space. But then again, I'm 6'3", so to shorter people this wasn't an issue. The basement had a bunch of small windows that would make it decently bright down there during the daytime, but obviously at this point it was dark. So I would use a flashlight. I brought the Thanksgiving containers down one by one, putting them near to the front of the basement just because I was lazy and wanted to go home and likely start the weekend. I was lugging one of the Christmas containers up the stairs and through the hallway when I heard a kid's voice and then laughing. It was very muffled, but I definitely knew what I heard. I stopped pushing the container and started looking around the place. I checked every classroom, then the indoor playroom, then the art room, then the bathrooms, every room I could think of. There were no kids in there. I kept hearing that muffled voice every once in a while though. The one place I didn't check was the basement. I walked back to the basement door and looked down the stairs, waiting. I heard a noise come from down there. The realization that there was a kid down there dawned on me, and so I ran down the stairs yelling "Who's down there?" thinking one of the kids snuck down there. I got to the bottom and ran the basement hallway to the storage room. I saw one of the toy cars moving for like a second before coming to a halt. It was 100% as if it had just been pushed. I stood in place and looked around the room. I didn't see any kids that could have just pushed that car. I said, "Anyone down here?" multiple times. It was dead silent. The silence was actually deafening. I started actually looking inside the boxes and containers, thinking a kid could be hiding in one of them. But halfway through, I started realizing there was no way a kid could close any of these containers or boxes on top of themselves. At this moment, I felt like I was alone, but that I also wasn't. I can't explain it. And then, right behind me, I heard something plastic drop to the floor. There was no draft whatsoever down in that basement. I didn't even turn to see what it was. I just fled to the upstairs without looking back. I stopped at the top of the stairs again, and when I heard what I could only describe as a child's whisper down there, I slammed the door shut. I didn't know what else to do except call Bob, and in short, he said if I think there's a kid down there that I need to call the police. The scary thing is, I didn't think there was a kid down there, but I still called 911. I just couldn't leave without confirming. And I was right that there were no kids down there, because with the help of a couple police officers, when we looked down there, there was nothing but a bunch of boxes and containers full of supplies and decorations. I also couldn't find anything on the floor that could have made that plastic sound dropping on the floor. Given the fact that there was nowhere else to hide down there, and no one reported their kids missing, the cops could do nothing except leave. I could tell the cops felt like I wasted their time, but I was too disturbed to be embarrassed of the police call. I quit right before Christmas, before I ever had to go back down to that basement again. This happened not too long ago. I live alone in my apartment. I'd like to get it out of the way that I don't take any medication, nor am I diagnosed with anything that would impair my awareness or cause me to hallucinate. This night was a one-time incident that I can't explain, and I really hope it stays a one-time incident. I had a long day at work. I work as a construction worker in the city, and I go to the gym 4 to 5 days a week on top of it. So depending on the projects we're working on at work, when I get home, I'm ready to collapse on a couch. After work and the gym one night, I stopped for food on the way home because there was no way on earth I was about to cook. I was shot. I got home and plopped the Chipotle I just bought on the ottoman in my living room, and I just laid out on the couch as I ate. This was later in the week, so I was already tiring out. I demolished the Chipotle, and I definitely could have eaten more, but I was honestly so tired that I actually fell asleep on the couch while watching TV. I woke up a few hours later, realizing it was like 11 o'clock at night. I was so comfortable on the couch under the blanket, honestly, that I didn't want to get up, but I realized I left my contacts in, so I went to the bathroom to take them out, and at that point, I went to my bedroom to just go to sleep in my actual bed. Walking to my room, I heard my name called from the living room. All I could think was, what the actual fuck? It was a female's voice. I turned back around and went into the living room. I flicked on the light, but the room was too blurry. I said, "Who was that? Mom?" No answer. I had to go get my glasses from my room if I wanted to see. I made my way to my nightstand and grabbed my glasses, and then went back out to the living room. I was the only breathing soul in here. My apartment isn't huge, it's just the kitchen and living room, which are one space, then my bedroom and a bathroom. Not many places to look, and not many places to hide. But there also shouldn't have been anyone in my apartment. I called my mom just to confirm she wasn't here, and I apparently woke her up with my phone call, so that answered that. I chalked it up to a brain fart moment, because clearly no one was in here, and so I went to bed. It wasn't as easy to fall asleep this time, because now all I was thinking about was how I just heard a voice say my name. It was when I was finally seemingly starting to fall asleep that I heard a female voice say my name again, from inside the bedroom. I flipped over on my back and looked across the room. All I could see was this big, tall, human-shaped mass a few feet in front of my bed. I could see the long hair of a woman, and I could barely see what I must have imagined to be distorted facial features. I let out a harrowing scream as I fumbled for the light switch or my glasses. I knocked over the lamp as I finally found the switch to turn it on, and now there was nothing at the end of my bed. I put on my glasses and searched every nook and cranny of the room, under the bed, the closets, and the dresser. Then I checked the rest of the apartment. I can say matter-of-factly that there was no one but me in this apartment. I felt like I was losing my mind. The only way I managed to go to sleep that night in that apartment was convincing myself I had hallucinated these things because of my lack of sleep or overworking myself. When I tell people about this, I downplay it, saying, yeah, I hallucinated this one time. I don't go into detail about how real it all was, because then some people get doubtful or think I was on drugs. It was without a doubt the scariest, most surreal moment of my life, hallucination or not. I'm 27 years old, living with my brother James in a house we share. Never had anything severely strange or abnormal happen to me in my life. But there was this one week that I experienced this strange series of events. It started on what I thought would be a normal night like any other. I was in the kitchen washing the dishes before getting ready for bed. Suddenly, a plastic cup came crashing to the floor. and the sound of it made me jump and spin around from the sink. I saw the blue plastic cup bounce a few times, then fall dead on the floor. This was one of the cups that sits up top the cabinet. I knew it had to have been sitting upright though. I had no idea what kind of force could have knocked it off the cabinet. It made no logical sense. I picked it up and put it back on the cabinet. That wasn't the last strange event that night though. While in bed with the blinds shut, there was suddenly a strange, very faint glow in my room. It came through the blinds. I flipped over onto my side and tried to peek under the crack at the bottom of the blinds, but I couldn't see anything. Honestly, as weird as it was, I was so comfortable in bed and was too lazy to go lift the blinds. I dismissed the light as something like a street light having a new bulb or something. I know, a little ridiculous, but at the time I had no reason to suspect anything paranormal. The next day I was home alone when James was at work. It was a dark, stormy day, and the house was constantly rumbling from the thunder, so when I heard a cup fall from the kitchen, I associated it with the thunder. I went to the kitchen to pick it up, and realized it was the same blue plastic cup I'd carefully put back on the cabinet yesterday. There was no way thunder could have knocked it down from where it was. I put it on the counter and stood there, confused and a bit shaken, looking around the kitchen, not knowing what to think. As I was standing in the kitchen, I heard a creak in the floor above me. The room above me was actually my bedroom. I went to the stairs and called up for James, but I instantly remembered he wasn't home. Maybe it was the thunder shaking the whole house. But still, I had to check my room just for peace of mind. I went up the stairs to my room and turned on the lights, given that all the rooms in the house were dark due to the weather. My room is square-shaped with 2 big closets. The room was clear, as were the closets, so I shut the light and went back downstairs. That night, when James got home, I had a discussion with him about the strange events that had been taking place. He said he hadn't been aware of any of it. Still, nothing that happened up until that point was extremely unusual. For the rest of the night, things were normal, and I fell asleep with ease. I awoke at some off hour in the night. It was still dark. I checked my phone. It was 2 in the morning. I rolled back on my side and shut my eyes. When I heard the distinct sound of a finger tapping on a window, I could feel my heart in my throat. I didn't know why someone would be knocking at my window, but I didn't want to see who could be out there. But for some reason, it took me that long to realize I was on the 2nd floor of the house. Therefore, nobody could be on the outside of my window. I pushed the sheets off my body and flipped to face the window. There was no one standing there on the inside though. So I lifted the blind, and there was no one outside either. Still, I knew that I heard what I heard, and I knew I hadn't been imagining or dreaming it. I ran to my brother's room and started freaking out. I don't know whether he believed me or not. Quite frankly, I don't think I'd believe me if I hadn't experienced it. I slept in the living room that night, and it's been 3 weeks now without any paranormal incidents. I never believed in the supernatural until this happened. I once took a road trip from New Hampshire to Florida. I had to stop at a hotel to sleep overnight when I was about halfway there. It was some old, somewhat dilapidated hotel that rested off the highway on a quiet road. There were like 2 cars in the parking lot, so there were definitely not a lot of guests. The lady at the front desk was very robotic and seemed bored with her job. She seemed to fit the atmosphere of the hotel perfectly. The lobby was full of tacky chairs and tables you'd expect to find put out on the curb. The wallpapers were all dated and equally tacky. Didn't matter though, I wasn't staying there for the luxury, just for the night and for the convenience. It was late when I checked in, so when I got in the room, all I did was take out my toothbrush and brush my teeth before jumping into the hotel bed. I turned out the lamp next to the bed and tried to go to sleep, not looking forward to the long day of driving I had ahead of me the next day. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I looked at the bedside clock to be sure that it was almost midnight. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. Apparently the peephole didn't work though, because I couldn't see out into the hallway through it. All I saw was black. I looked down at the crack under the door, but didn't see any outlines of feet blocking the light, so I opened the door just a little bit to peek into the hallway. When I didn't see anyone standing in front of the door, I opened it fully and then peeked down both sides of the hallway. It was clear. So I had to suddenly question if someone in this relatively vacant hotel was pranking me. I shut the door, locked it with the bolt this time, and went to lay back down in the bed. But then it happened again, a knock at the door. This time I jumped out of the bed, ran to the door, and checked the peephole again. Shockingly, all I saw was the empty hallway outside. But it hit me. This time I could actually see through the peephole. I unbolted the door and opened it. No one. I looked down both sides of the hallway again, and there was no one. This was where I drew the line. I grabbed the key to the room and went to the lady at the front desk. I told her someone kept knocking on my door, and politely asked her to check the cameras to see who it could be. She said they didn't have cameras in the hallways. Her reaction also wasn't what I was hoping for. She seemed very calm and disconcerted with what I told her. She said in a calm voice there was only one other guest in the whole building. Then she just stared blankly at me. I'm not sure how she thought her response properly acknowledged my concern or what she expected me to say, but I could tell she wouldn't be of any help with the matter, so I left her and went back to my room. I locked the door with the bolt again. This time I put on my headphones and put on one of those 10-hour sleep relaxation videos on YouTube. This would not only help me get to sleep, but block out any possible future sounds from whoever was deciding to mess with me. And it worked. For a while at least. Eventually I flipped from my side to my back, just looked around the room. My head froze when I was staring at the corner. I sat up to try to get a closer look at what I thought I was seeing. I swear it looked like a giant humanoid figure, like a 10-foot-tall human, standing right in the corner, head to the ceiling. When I put that image together in my head, I felt a sudden rush of horror in my body. I jumped across the bed to flick on the lamp, but when the room lit up, there was nothing in that corner of the room. I simply sat there with my heart beating probably 200 beats per minute. I gave myself a couple minutes to calm down before shutting the light back off and laying back down on my side. I still had the headphones in my ears playing the relaxation video. It helped calm me down a little bit. I didn't last even 2 minutes without sitting back up and examining the room again, however. And there it was in the corner, what looked to be a 10-foot-tall humanoid figure. I crawled to the edge of the bed to get as close a look as I could before practically shitting myself. I saw what I was sure was a long arm at the side, moving. I dove to turn on the lamp again, and the corner was empty again. I didn't stick around that time. I packed up my few things in a matter of seconds and left the room. I gave the key to the woman and said I'm checking out early. She didn't even say a word as I stormed out that front door of the hotel. I continued driving until I found another hotel, where I fell fast asleep with no supernatural disturbances. As a kid, I had a bedroom on the first floor. Money was a little tight, and our mom was taking care of 4 kids. I was the youngest, so I had the little room. My room was next to the living room, a small square room with wood flooring. There were 2 big vents in the floor in this room in 2 opposite corners, and also 2 vents in the ceiling. My bed took up half the room. Like I said, it was a very small room. I'll keep it short and straight to the point. I was 13 years old doing my homework on my bed since I didn't have a desk in my room, when I heard a child's laughter. I went outside my room to look around the living room and kitchen for any of my siblings. Everyone seemed to be upstairs though. Usually in these kinds of stories you hear people say they just chalk these kinds of things up to their imagination, but that's stupid. I definitely heard that laughter. There's no way I imagined something so clear. I continued my homework, but with one ear perked up listening for any other suspicious sounds. Eventually enough time passed that I was able to move past it. In fact, it seems it was just about when I was able to get over it that I heard it again. A child's laughter. Or more so, giggling, I should say. This time it went on longer. It wasn't coming from outside my room. It was somewhere in the room. I figured one of my brothers were hiding from me. I followed the sound of the laughter, strangely to the corner of my room. Then I looked down at the vent on the floor. It was coming from inside the vent. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear up to the vent. There was no more giggling at this point though. When there was a silence for a few seconds, I lifted my ear from the vent and then put my eyes up to the vent to get a peek inside. It took me a second to realize I was staring at a pair of eyes looking back up at me. I shrieked like a girl and screamed for my mom. She came storming into my room moments later, but of course the noises were gone, as were the eyes. My mom thought I was going crazy due to a lack of sleep, but I refused to sleep in that room, so she let me sleep in her room that night. That went on for a week actually, before she put her foot down. I spent the next 4 years in that same bedroom before we moved, and nothing paranormal ever happened to me since that one particular night. I'll never forget the time me and my brother snuck out past our bedtimes to explore an allegedly haunted house down the block. Yes, I said bedtime, as I was only 10 and my brother Luke was only 12. When our parents said goodnight to us, I went to Luke's room and we took a couple hand-powered flashlights with us and hopped outside through the window. Luckily, his room was on the first floor. Those hand-powered flashlights worked by constantly pushing in a little trigger that would create light inside the lens. They were noisy as hell, but they were convenient. Once we were outside, we just walked down the block, and in 2 minutes we were there. It was rumored by all the neighborhood kids and teens that the place was haunted. Everything about it was creepy. The older, more antique design of the house, the isolation from the rest of the houses, and the broken windows and rotting wood. It seemed perfect for a horror movie. We went around to the backyard. This was all my curious and confident brother's idea. I was scared shitless. The door was locked, as expected. I felt a bit of relief, thinking we might just go home, but my brother made a shocking move next. He grabbed a plank of wood laying in the grass and began smashing the already chipped window. Eventually there was enough of an opening to unlock it and slide it up completely. We hopped inside and began cranking those noisy-ass flashlights. Immediately after entering the house, we both picked up on the fact that it was like 90 degrees in there, which was odd as it was a September night in the mid-70s. There was no graffiti or anything anywhere. In fact, it was relatively empty besides a few pieces of furniture that were clearly not worth taking along. It seemed we were the first to enter the house, shockingly, or at least from the back. We went upstairs to the main floor from the little den area and continued cranking the flashlights. That's when we heard the slightest crack in the floorboards from right above us. We both jumped. I tugged for Luke to leave, but he told me the place is old as hell, it's just house noises. I stopped cranking the flashlight at this point, and I urged Luke to do the same, but he only called me stupid for suggesting something so ridiculous. Then there was another crack in the floorboards from above us. He began walking upstairs. I didn't want to go up there, but I was not about to stay down there alone. I followed behind him to the upstairs. There was a door that led to a room right above where we were standing. I begged him not to open it, but he must have just wanted to be the big, tough older brother. He began to reach for the doorknob while still cranking the noisy flashlight, but then he stopped. I was confused. I could see in the dark he was moving his ear up against the door, listening for something. Silence. Then, the most deafening, nightmare-inducing moment of my life. A single bang on the door from the other side sent my brother staggering into the wall in pain, covering his ear. We dropped the flashlights and ran straight out the back door and back home. We were so loud when we got back that our parents found us out. We told them what happened, but they naturally didn't care and grounded us both for a week. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of something from outside my window and a glare of brightness sneaking in through my slightly opened blind. I sat up, and my heart sank when I realized it was the sound of the crank to my flashlight. I stood up and looked out the window, and that's when it stopped. There was nothing but complete blackness out there after that. I woke the next day barely remembering what happened, and I still hope today that that part was just a dream.
This is a story that happened to me recently. I was still in my first year of university, and I've only just made friends with a few other students. Albeit an old and notorious university for its ghostly figures and paranormal activity, the campus janitors and security were all too familiar with unusual reports. The art and design faculty was subjected to the oldest campus of the 4 separate buildings, and the block my class happened to progress in was the allegedly haunted section as well. It was late in the afternoon, just before 5, and my friend needed to use the restroom. She asked me to accompany her, and I obliged, seeing it as an opportunity to rest my eyes from the strains of the projector. She rushed into one of the stalls, and I waited outside the bathroom. Feeling that she would take longer than I initially anticipated, I decided to walk back to class without telling her. As soon as I sat down, she barged into the class, calling out for me. According to her claim, she heard the sink's tap turn on and thought it was me playing a prank. As she opened the door, she saw no one else in the restroom besides herself, yet the other stall next to her was locked from the inside. Thinking it was someone else on the toilet, she asked if it was me. No answer. Curious, she looked down the gap but saw no shoes or legs, yet heard feminine whispers and humming from that particular stall. Frightened, she left without saying another word. Class ended and we went home, but the thought of the occurrence remained. We later learned from one of the janitors that no one should ever be in the restroom after 5 in the evening, as there is a known ghost of a woman who resides in the stalls. Needless to say, as juniors in the university, my friends and I decided to never use the bathrooms after the designated time. I'm not in any way saying these claims are true, but everything I told you is true in regards to what I was told. Whether these things I was told by my friend and the janitor are true or not remains a mystery to me. This happened a few months ago while I was serving in Japan as a missionary for the Mormon Church. I was in the country for 2 years, and my time to return home was approaching. I was in my last area, Kyoto, a bustling tourist attraction, an ancient Japanese city I've wanted to visit all my life. Anyway, it was late at night, and my companion and I were knocking on doors to see if anyone had interest in learning about Christ. We came across this one apartment building and decided to give it a shot. In Japan, there are 3 kinds of apartments: super luxurious suites, decent apartments with 4 to 5 rooms total, or ghetto as crap. This apartment was the latter. We were on the 2nd floor of this building and knocked on this one door. A middle-aged man in worn-out clothes answered with an awkward smile on his face. Being the kind missionaries we were, we introduced ourselves and asked him if he would like to learn about what we believe. Instead of giving us a direct answer, he invited us in. Usually, in missionary work, this is a good sign, but upon stepping foot into that apartment, I knew what we got ourselves into. This apartment reeked with the smell of marijuana and urine. His apartment was puny: a small entryway, a door on the left leading into a bathroom, a small kitchen to the right, and a small multi-purpose room with a small kneeling table, TV, and bed. That's it. Judging by the way he was behaving and most of the decor in his apartment, I knew this guy definitely had some sins worth confessing. He sat us down on either side of the table and started to rant on about how he hates Christians and wants to kill them. That made my companion and I tense up a bit. But the man was plastered. In the time this was going on, he drank like 10 times his weight in booze. We just prayed and hoped he wouldn't recognize who we were and what he was telling us. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you a secret and you can't tell anyone." He then pulled out from under his bed a box. He opened it to reveal thousands and thousands of dollars worth of Japanese yen, and yes, it was authentic. We even examined it. This man was an illegal drug lord who worked with the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia group. We then realized that if this man knew what he just did and showed us, he would kill us for sure, or at least take us hostage. My companion and I feared for our lives and tried to come up with an excuse to get away, but he wouldn't let us go. He kept ranting on about irrelevant things and saying how Christianity was an evil cult of some kind. We tried to explain our side of the story, but there's no use in reasoning with a drunk drug lord who works for the Japanese mafia. It then got to the point where we practically had to run for the door. We said we were leaving, stood up, and quickly walked over to the door. The guy then stood up and began to reach for something in a box, but we never saw what it was. As soon as the door closed, we bolted home, faster than we ever had. The last thing we wanted was him sobering up to find out he had revealed his deepest, darkest secrets to 2 Christian missionaries from America. Had this man not been drunk, he probably would have killed us. For all we know, he was reaching for a gun as we were leaving. When I was 15 years old, I was home alone one night for whatever reason. My bedroom was on the first floor, right next to the living room. It's a strange setup. I had the door shut and was playing video games when I heard a strange sound come out from in the living room. It took me a few moments to figure out that it was a tap on the window. I stepped through the dark living room and out the front door and checked the bushes by the window. Nobody was there. I went back to my room with the door open and resumed playing the game. 5 seconds later, another knock on the glass. This time I ran to the front door barefoot, ready to chase the pranksters, but again, no one was in the bushes. No one was even in sight. I chose to just ignore it from here on out. On my way back to my room, there was another knock. I ran over to the window to try and catch them. There wasn't anyone outside, but I felt something right above the tip of my toes. I looked down and saw the dark shadow of a figure sitting down by the window. I think I was back in my room in a matter of 2 seconds with the door locked. I was hiding under my bed trying to call my dad. The knocking on the glass continued from outside. When I explained to my dad, he called me crazy for not calling the police, so he told me he would for me and to wait in my room with the door locked. I'd say about 5 minutes later, the knocking stopped, and 10 minutes later, the cops arrived. The figure was gone, but there were no signs of entry or exit, as all the doors were locked and all the windows shut. Still, we haven't seen or heard of anything since then, but it's still creepy as hell to think about. I was at home alone playing Call of Duty between 1 AM and 2 AM. During this time, I got a phone call from a random phone number, and of course, the first thing I think of is that it's just somebody who's either prank calling me or just doesn't have the right number. After I hung up, a few seconds later, I received a phone call from the same number. When this happened, I'll admit I felt a little chill run down my spine, but since I was home alone, I was thinking that if this person was just prank calling me, I could say whatever I want until either I or the person hangs up. So I answered it. I said hello in a sort of annoyed voice, but there was no response. Instead, all I heard was something that still freaks me out. I heard what sounded like a cat hissing, but in a much deeper pitch. Of course, out of surprise, I became defensively hostile. I said into the phone, "Look, buddy, if you call this number again, I'll have my friend who's a police officer track this number and arrest you." But this didn't even faze whoever was on the other end of the phone. Instead, all I got in response was disturbing low-pitched laughter. My heart dropped. "Why are you calling?" I said. Then, this is what still gives me nightmares to this day. As clear as day, in a dark, almost demonic voice, I heard, "I'm just waiting for you to come upstairs." Without hesitation, I ran out of the house and ran across the street to my friend's house and asked his dad to call my dad while trying to explain to him what happened at the same time. After he called my dad, my friend's dad called the police. They arrived in 5 minutes and found nothing upstairs, but they did find the back door open. My dad used to be a paramedic, and after he retired, he remained good friends with a lot of people, one of them being my godmother, Sally. Sally owned a bunny farm and was very friendly. My family and I loved her dearly, and my parents decided to make her my godmother, but she also had a brother named Terry. Terry was a very quiet man. He never said much and kinda had a weird vibe on him, but he was never around that much, so I didn't give it much thought. It was Thanksgiving and we all decided to eat together. It was a great dinner, but his presence just really made me uncomfortable. While they were over, my godmother and I were working on the computer my parents used, and I noticed my brother and Terry were in the family room. I went out to see them just watching TV. Nothing was going on. The next day we all went to church, and Terry asked me if my brother had a Facebook account. I said no, because that was the truth. My brother wasn't into social media, but my thoughts began to wonder why he wanted to befriend my younger brother. At some point he added me on Facebook, and I noticed that his avatar was that anonymous figure. Weird. Why didn't he have his face on his account? I got an instant message from him. The chat went like this. "Hey there," he said. "Hi. What are you doing up so late?" "I'm a night owl, so I'm usually up late." "Doesn't that make your parents mad?" he said. They don't mind," I said. "A naughty girl, aren't we? Staying up late. Would you like to chat?" "Actually, I gotta go now. I have homework," I said, quickly going invisible and closing him out. What the hell kind of chat was that? He was talking to me like I was some slut or something. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to go to his account. He didn't have his friends list blocked, so I was able to see all his friends. What I saw and what I felt that night will always haunt me. He had over 200 friends, and all of them were young men between the ages of 14 to 18. I was so sick as I saw some of the boys were shirtless in their boxers or worse. It's not the fact that he's into men that freaked me out. No, I wouldn't care if he was gay. But this man was targeting young men. Terry was in his 40s. This is why he wanted to know if my brother had a Facebook account. He wanted to add him in his sick boy list. I was shaking as I realized what kind of man this was. I loved my godmother, but this was just sick. I told my parents and reported his account. My dad was shocked, but he also wasn't too surprised, because apparently Terry was reported for selling drugs to kids and touching them on the news one day. I found out the case was dropped because the boys said they were lying, but now I wonder, were they really lying? Since then we stopped talking to my godmother and her sick brother. His Facebook account was taken down, but I know he's still out there targeting young men. I still have nightmares of him going after me and my brother. My parents recently bought a cabin in the woods and would always spend their weekends up there. My little sister would always go with them, so I spent a lot of time home alone over the weekends. One evening, I was bored out of my mind, so I plopped my butt down and played some Legend of Zelda. Now, over the years of living in this house, I developed some kind of natural reaction. Every now and again, whenever my parents needed me, they would call me from the top of the stairs. And for the record, my room was in the basement. Then I would pause the game or stop what I was doing and walk to the stairs and ask them what they needed. And it happened very often. So often, I keep an ear out for the faintest sound coming from upstairs. This one particular night, as I was playing Zelda, I heard someone call my name from upstairs.
Brandon?
With this natural instinct kicking in, I got up and walked toward the stairs. It wasn't until I was about halfway to the stairs did I remember that my parents were not home. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me or something. I returned back to the land of Hyrule until I heard my name called again.
Brandon?
This time, it was louder, and the voice wasn't my father's. In fact, it wasn't anyone from my family's voice. Maybe a neighbor's? But I know my neighbors well, and I didn't recognize the voice. I bolted upstairs to investigate, shouting for a response. I got none. I looked out the window in our dining room area that gave me a good view of our street. I live in a house at the far end of a cul-de-sac, so we can see every house on the street. Right before the street opens into the big circle of asphalt, there was a dim streetlight illuminating the street. Standing directly under the light was a dark and shadowy figure. I tried to see if I could recognize him, but I couldn't, until I realized something about the man that made my blood freeze in horror. The man had no shadow, and I know that because he was directly under a light source. His shadow would be beneath him, but no. I looked in between the legs. No shadow whatsoever. Suddenly, the streetlight flickered for a split second, and the shadow man disappeared. I then ran frantically around the house, making sure every door and window was locked and secured. I then locked myself in a closet beneath the staircase and played Pokemon on my DS for the rest of the night.
If you want to listen to these stories plus some exclusive ones on your favorite apps, all of them are available to listen to on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music. Just click the link in the description or at the end of the video. There's an abandoned motel called the Royal Hawaiian Motel. It's been abandoned for, I'm pretty sure, well over a decade. I do a lot of solo urban exploration, sometimes at night. The Royal Hawaiian Motel is located in Baker, California, and during the day it gets scorching hot, too hot to be walking around with my backpack. So I chose to go to the motel during the night. It was very easy to get to. I parked on the side of the road and walked over. There really was no fence or anything to hop over, and there was no security. It was one of the easier structures to get to that I've explored for sure. In the back was a really deep pool with a ton of graffiti. I shined my flashlight up at the actual motel, and I noticed half of the upstairs room's doors were slid open slightly or just completely shattered. Kinda creepy looking, but also expected since the place had been abandoned for so long. Of course, other people have explored there. A part of the motel also looked like it had been engulfed in flames and partially burnt down. I looked around the outside for a little while. It was late at night, so there were no sounds of nearby passing traffic. Besides the sounds of my shoes stepping over various pieces of debris, at one point, my blood ran cold when I heard a voice from somewhere in the vicinity. It sounded like a female's voice. My first instinct in these scenarios is to assume it's some kind of security worker or somebody who may cause trouble for me, so I typically tend to walk out of sight and hide. That's what I did. I ran to one of the other rooms on the ground level and turned off my flashlight. I waited just a minute, and after hearing nothing, I turned it back on. I looked around this little room I was in, and the walls were littered with graffiti. There was only one piece of furniture in here. It was a little dresser with like 4 drawers on it, and then some dusty, dirty old mattress on the floor. I wondered if homeless people would come and sleep here, but honestly, it's just so far away from any real civilization that I doubted it. I left the room and continued around the motel. I would peek inside every little opening on the ground floor below the overhead walkway for the upper level rooms. Each room was pretty similar to the last, with different miscellaneous graffiti and writings on the walls and old dilapidated furniture. Then I heard a crash type sound from above, like something falling over. I felt my heart skip a beat. I went back outside and pointed my flashlight up at the walkway above, at the broken glass doors. I felt a rush as I decided to go up there and check out the rooms. What I felt like deep down was that there was an animal in one of the rooms, but there's always that chance that you run into other explorers or perhaps a homeless person in places like this. I made my way upstairs and peeked into each room that I passed. They were all similarly furnished, with junk, debris, old mattresses, and odd pieces of old furniture. As I walked further down the walkway, a banging sound became audible. It got louder as I continued to walk. It was a consistent, slow banging, like thump, 2 seconds, thump, 2 seconds, thump. Someone was here. I approached the door to the room I was positive that it was coming from. As I got closer, it stopped. Uh-oh. Maybe they heard my footsteps. I announced to whoever was in there that I'm just an explorer and I mean no harm. I peeked into the room with the flashlight now off. It was almost pitch black in there, but I'm 50% certain I saw the shape of a person a little further into the room by the back wall. The room smelled like straight feces. I pulled my head out from the room to look down at my flashlight and turn it on, but in a careful position to not point the light right into the room right away. I aimed it down at first at the floor, and then peered into the room again, and slowly pointed the light into the room. And I saw two pale bare feet approaching me fast. In a muscle jerk reaction, I pointed the light up more to fully reveal this woman with a bloodied forehead and yellow gunk on her mouth which was hanging open. It was a sight from a nightmare. I was out of there so quick. I heard the woman screaming as I was running away, and her screams didn't get much further away, which told me she was chasing after me. I ran down the stairs and back outside. I ran the entire way back to my car. I wasn't followed this far. I called one of my good friends, George, who's also into urban exploration. I had invited him to come with me originally to this place, but he was unable to. I told him what just happened. We came to a weird and disturbing agreement that the thumping I was hearing was that woman banging her head on the wall, hence why her forehead was so bloody. When I asked if I should call the police, kind of just thinking out loud, he said definitely not, as I'd be admitting to trespassing. I actually drove around the immediate area by the Taco Bell and the few stores in the area, looking for a payphone so I could anonymously call the police about this deranged, dangerous woman. But obviously payphones are really a thing of the past, so it was just a pointless effort. What I ended up doing was calling the non-emergency number and reporting the deranged woman, but also claiming I was not the one to find her, rather I heard someone else had run into her. I was as vague as possible and I hung up. Because I didn't want to stick around there, I don't know if the police eventually went to investigate, but whatever was wrong with that woman, she should have been in a psych ward or something. In all of my years of exploring, I'd never encountered anything like that. A few years ago, I lived in a small town. My family decided to move us 4 hours away to get away from all the drama. While my parents were out of town picking out houses, I brought my friend over and called up my cousins to take a little road trip. The place I wanted to go was pretty much off limits, but we were daredevils and wanted to experience something scary. We picked a place that was 2 to 3 hours away called Bryce Hospital. This place was supposedly haunted due to the history of it. It was a psychiatric facility where they would keep mentally ill people. There were rumors about how some of the patients were mistreated and tortured. As the population declined, they eventually shut down. Over the years, the building began rotting and succumbing to nature. We decided to leave around 11 p.m. so we could make it there by 2 a.m. The car ride was pretty fun, and we were all very pumped to see what we would find. We arrived around like 2:43 a.m. and stopped at the beginning of the dirt road that led to it. We sat there for a few minutes, contemplating if we should really do this or not, because we already had a bad feeling. After 10 minutes of staring at a dark road, we decided to go on. As we went down the road, it felt like it would never end. The grass was fully grown and there were branches everywhere. It was pitch black and we could barely even see the road. We finally made it to the building, and once we did, we all just stared in amazement. It was huge. The roof was rotted off and vines were growing all over the walls. In the middle of the parking lot, or what was once the parking lot, had a giant old water fountain that also had vines growing from the sides. It was so dark we could only see with the headlights illuminated. We turned the car off and got out. We began walking into the building, and the first thing I noticed was pentagrams sprayed all over the walls. We kept walking farther in, and made our way up the stairs, which was very hard considering they were practically non-existent. We climbed a ladder and got onto what was left of the roof. We looked around and noticed a light in the front of the building. It looked like a phone light. We called out, but nobody answered, and the light vanished as quickly as it appeared. My cousin told us to follow him into another room so he could make sure we were safe, but I had a terrible feeling. I wandered off into another room that was right beside the room they were in. I looked around and saw old mattresses and more graffiti. I heard my cousins talking when all of a sudden, I heard a faint sound. It was like someone threw a rock at the window of the room I was in. I didn't think anything of it and kept looking around. I met back up with my cousins and friend. We decided to go to the basement to check it out. Once we got down there, we had to take a break because it was difficult getting to the bottom due to the stairs being smashed. We sat there, catching our breath, until we heard a voice from the back of the room. We all paused, looking at each other. I was too afraid to move, fearing whatever was in there would come after me. My cousin walked back there slowly and shined his light around. As the light reached the far end of the room, he saw someone squatted, looking towards the wall. My cousin began backing up slowly, with the light still on the guy. Once he got back to where we were, he lifted us out and began pulling himself out. Once we were out, he yelled to the man, asking if he was okay. The man turned around and stared blankly at us. There was a moment of silence before the man let out wild screams. He began running towards us. We all started screaming and running away. We had no idea where to run, but ended up climbing out of the window. We ended up in the woods behind the building. I remember running and screaming because I heard the man right behind me. My cousins were far ahead of me, and I saw their flashlights slowly fading. I ran into so many trees that my entire body started to ache. I finally caught up to them in a clearing. We found a trail and started trying to find our way back to the car, but we ended up going the wrong direction for an hour and decided to turn back and try the other direction. It was a grueling way back, but we finally saw the building again and sighed with relief knowing we weren't far from the car. As we approached the car, we heard rustling in one of the bushes by the building, and like before, a rock flew out and hit my friend. We saw the man emerge from the bush, and we had to make a run for the car. As we were running, the man was a decent length behind us to where we could open the doors and lock them once we got in. We started up the car, and when we did, the headlights turned on, only to show the man running towards us. He started banging on the windows with a glass bottle. We put it in drive and took off out of there. The whole entire time we were heading home, we sat in silence. I think we all felt the same sense of shock. My body was shaking. After that night, we never had any interest in urban exploring ever again. This happened in the countryside of Georgia. I was 15 at the time with my brother Seb, who was 18. Seb was big on exploring creepy places, and he somehow heard of this huge abandoned house not far from us from someone he knew. I guess he didn't want to explore it alone, so one day he brought me along with him to go check it out. Seb parked the car in a rather hidden location, covered by a bunch of trees. The house property wasn't visible from here. We'd have to walk down this concrete road that clearly hadn't been touched in forever. There were giant cracks with grass and weeds growing through it just about everywhere. All the grass around the road was overgrown, almost overtaken with weeds as well. Suddenly we noticed a woman down the road walking behind us in our direction. I asked Seb what we should do, and he said to just play it cool. If we started to run, it would look suspicious. The woman was walking with both her hands folded behind her back, as if she were going for a relaxing stroll. We kept walking at our regular pace, maybe picking it up a bit just slightly. I turned around once more, and she was much closer now, and I could see a smile on her face. She was looking back at me. Then she said, "Lovely day today, isn't it?" My brother and I simultaneously responded, "Yeah." She kept walking behind us, getting closer and closer. Then, as she was almost right on top of us, with her hands still folded behind her back, she said, "I have to go to bed now." Seb and I looked at one another with confused looks. We both picked up the pace now without saying a word to each other. We just saw in each other's faces that it was time to speed up and get away from this woman. My brother turned around one last time and said, "Have a great day, ma'am." We stayed in the speed walk pace for a while, and the next time we turned around, that woman was gone, completely off the road. That meant she must have taken off into the woods, which was incredibly creepy. It was absolutely a chilling start to this little field trip. We made it to the house. It was noticeably deteriorated. There were vines of ivy growing up certain parts of the walls. Some of the glass windows were shattered, meaning it had been explored before. And that's exactly how we entered the house, through one of the broken windows. We climbed in, making sure not to cut ourselves on any broken glass. Right from the start, surprisingly, there was a lot of stuff left behind, like all the furniture, albeit it looked a little worn out, all the wall decor, the little decorations on the coffee table. Even when we went into the kitchen and checked the fridge, there were food items left behind. Very rotten food items. Opening that fridge was like getting smacked in the face with the smell of death. After checking the whole first floor, we went down to the basement. The basement, like the first floor, was still completely furnished, although down here was a lot messier. There were a ton of things like loose sheets of paper and garbage spread out on the floor. The carpet was a faded blue color. There was a little bit of light that came into the room through the windows at the top of the walls. And then we heard a noise from upstairs. A distinct thump. We both just froze like statues, waiting for any kind of noise again. Within a few seconds, we chalked it up to just being a noise of an old, deteriorating house. There wasn't much else to see in the basement, so we went back up to the first floor, and the only place left to check was the upstairs. At the top of the stairs, from what I remember, was the bathroom directly in front of the stairs, and then to the left was a small hallway that led to an open door, and then the hallway cut left. I don't remember what was to the right, but I'll tell you why in a second. Seb and I went left and into the first doorway. It was a bedroom. A decently sized bedroom, but it didn't seem like the master bedroom. There was a double bed in there, and an antique-looking dresser. There were some old articles of clothing left behind in the dresser, nothing I wanted to touch. Seb left the room first, and then he said my name, in a very concerned, scared-sounding tone. I looked up at him, and he was looking down the hall. I stepped into the hall, and saw what he was looking at. There was that woman from earlier, standing in front of the bed in another bedroom at the end of the short hallway. She was still smiling like before. She opened her mouth and said, "Do you want to see what's behind my back?" My brother screamed, "Fuck you," and he pushed me to start running. We both made a beeline for the front door and sprinted to the outside. I couldn't help but look back at the house, at the upstairs windows, expecting her to be at one of them, but she wasn't. I also just had to make sure she wasn't chasing after us. We kept running until we were out of sight from the house, and then we kept running some more, even though my cardio sucked and I was out of breath. When we finally made it back to the car, I gagged, trying to throw up from exhaustion. We got in the car and Seb drove us home. The whole ride, we couldn't stop theorizing what it was that just happened. We said it might have been some loony woman off her meds or escaped from a mental facility or something. Maybe she was living in that abandoned house. But even explaining all of that away, the big question is, what did she have behind her back? And was she holding it that whole time she was walking behind us? So many questions that will never be answered. It was a weekend night, November of 2015. My 7-year-old son Sean was having a sleepover with 4 of his friends. At the time, my wife wasn't home for whatever reason, so I had to keep a somewhat close watch on them without making it too obvious. They were all in Sean's room making a lot of noise, and when things would get either too quiet or too loud, I would sneak over to the bedroom door and just listen to what was going on. You may think that's weird, but this was my wife's instructions, and any married man knows you never want to go against what your wife tells you to do. When it was getting a little loud, I went over to the door and heard that they were all just simply playing with Legos and other toys very loudly. So I went back to the living room to watch TV. Eventually, I heard weird thumping type noises coming from my son's room. I muted the TV and could distinguish them to be taps on one of the windows. I figured, let them have their fun so long as they're not breaking anything. I unmuted the TV. However, I quickly realized things went completely silent from down the hall in my son's room. Now I was nervous that they might have broken something, because it was very uncommon for them to all be completely silent for so long. So I once again crept over to Sean's bedroom door and listened. I could hear quiet giggling and whispering in the room. I finally opened the door out of curiosity and saw the 4 boys sitting on the rug with a mess of toys scattered all over the place. I noticed that the window was completely open. I told Sean to keep it shut, and to also keep the noise down a little bit before shutting the door. I made a stop into the bathroom before planning to go back to the living room. However, when I was in the bathroom, I noticed through the corner of my eye a black shadow passing the window outside. I ran back to my son's room and told the 4 boys not to go outside. Then, that's when it hit me. There were only 4 boys in the room as opposed to 5. Sean's friend Tom was missing. In a panic, I yelled at Sean to tell me where he was, and they all pointed to the open window. Sean said that he left with the pirate to go find the treasure. In that moment, I felt a mixture of feelings in my stomach, but mostly like it was about to explode. I wouldn't be able to fit through that window, so I ran out the front door and caught view of a man holding Tom's hand and walking towards a car. I yelled at him to stop. They both turned around, and then the man let go of Tom, hopped into the tan-colored Toyota Corolla, and floored it down the streets. I ran to grab Tom and brought him back inside. I was no longer comfortable with this sleepover and called all of the parents, told them what happened, and suggested they all come and pick up their kids, which is exactly what they did. I received a bit of criticism from Tom's parents at first, but they ultimately thanked me, and their son is still good friends with my son. The boys all said that a random man came to Sean's window, knocked on it, lifted it open himself, and talked in a pirate voice, asking one of the kids to come with him to find the treasure. The fact that this happened in the assumed safety of my own house, and that it actually worked, is what disturbs me the most. Me, my friend Sarah, and my best friend Canada needed to find something to do and somewhere to smoke. There are woods in a very short walking distance from Sarah's house, and us all being very adventurous 15-year-olds thought that that would be perfect. We could smoke, then adventure the woods. Thinking back, I wish we would have smoked behind Sarah's house and just watched scary stories or some shit, but we didn't. When we made it to the opening that led into the woods that we went in, we adventured, we smoked, and overall, we had fun. And I wish this story ended there. You could clearly see anyone entering or exiting the woods from the streets. Sarah lives in a very nice neighborhood, except one house beside the woods that we were in. This house was old, and me and my friends often joked about how it looked like something out of The Hills Have Eyes. It was a rusty, blue tin house with pigs in the backyard. We were all on the path exiting the woods when we saw a bluish-gray Chevy pickup. The truck started up, and me and my friends jokingly decided to run away from it, and we were shocked to see the truck started following us. Every time we stopped, so did it. We took off running. There was a small hill that we hid behind so the truck couldn't see us. The truck passed, and after a while, we got up, laughed it off, and started walking out of the woods, thinking it was a joke. After about 5 minutes of walking, we started to approach the exit, but we were all struck with fear when we saw headlights blocking the exit. We looked at each other, wondering what to do. Upon looking into the truck, I saw that it was a larger-sized man in a hat and red shirt, but that was all I could see from that distance. In panic, Canada pulled out a small pocket knife. However, I didn't have much trust in her abilities to use it, so I took the knife as we all ran into the woods until we thought we were safe. We waited for a second, gathering our thoughts and our breath, and finally left the woods and went to Sarah's house. This happened at the end of our freshman year of high school. We are all in the middle of our sophomore year now, and we've since stayed away from those woods for months. On September 10th, however, we went into the woods one last time. It was Sarah's birthday, and again, we needed to find somewhere to smoke. There were 6 girls and 2 boys, so we thought it would be fine to go back into the woods, figuring safety in numbers. After entering the woods and walking for a while, we found a path. Me, Sarah, and Canada had seen the path before, but we never adventured it. To get to the path, you had to go down a small, steep hill. We all made it down the hill, and soon after came up to a fork in the path leading 2 ways. We chose to go left. It was a short trail which led to a small building that looked like it was abandoned before having been fully built. There was a wooden ladder, a small fire pit, but perhaps the oddest thing we found were the saws hanging by strings from tree to tree. Given that we were all stoned, perhaps we didn't take the findings as seriously as we normally would have. We decided to adventure down the right side of the fork in the path. Not far down the path, we found something truly horrific. There was a hangman-like structure, there was a noose on the ground, an old pair of shoes nearby, and a shovel. I'd never felt so uneasy in my life. We took pictures of everything and we quickly left the woods safely, and I've made a personal promise to never go back into those woods. We believe the man who chased us in the pickup truck had something to do with what we found in the woods, and we were only more grateful after this that he didn't catch us. I'm 27 years old. I live alone in a rural town in Virginia, about 2 blocks away from my parents. My parents are both in their 60s, and my mom has become a very worrisome woman in her old age.
Sometimes she walks over uninvited and lets herself in, since I had regrettably given her a key, which can get a bit annoying. Like if I would be out really late on weekends at a bar or with women, I would sometimes come home to my mom sitting in the living room waiting, worried sick. I know you may just think, oh my god, that's crazy, why not just put your foot down and tell her to stop? Well, because you don't know my mom. It's very hard to describe her, but she's the kind of worrisome, innocent little lady that you just can't bring yourself to go against. And I hate to mention, she also has mild dementia. Anyway, this was Saturday night. I think it was around 2 in the morning. I was at a nearby club with a group of college friends, really the only place to hang out in this boring town, and I was getting ready to head home. I said goodbye to all my friends and walked the 3 blocks it took to get back to my house. I walked up my front stoop in my drunken haze and dug my hand in my pocket for my keys. When I grabbed the doorknob, I realized it was unlocked. My mom was here again. I quietly opened and shut the front door, locking it behind me. I put my keys on the kitchen counter and found a note written in my mom's handwriting saying, "You forgot this at our house, next to the box of half-eaten cake my parents didn't want." I didn't see my mom anywhere, so I assumed she must have gone upstairs to sleep in the guest bed until I got back, which is something she would commonly do as well. Then I heard footsteps upstairs, confirming it, and that's when I sighed once again. 27 years old, almost 3 in the morning, and she still has to wait up and treat me like a child. I ran upstairs to check the guest bed, empty, along with all the bathrooms. I was afraid Mom was having one of her episodes due to her condition, so I ran to the phone to call my dad. After 4 rings, my dad picked up in a groggy voice, asking what the hell is the matter. After I told him that I heard Mom wandering around upstairs in my house, there was a short pause, and then he said, "That's not possible, she's sleeping right next to me." My mouth fell open as I turned my head to face the dark upstairs, and just barely by the light provided by the kitchen, I could see a head peering around from the corner at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. I screamed into the phone as I ran out the front door and down the street to my parents' house, explaining to my father on the way. About halfway there, my dad told me, "Alright, I'm gonna call the cops," and hung up. I made it to my parents' house, where my mom was already waiting at the door, worried sick. My mom explained that she did come over to clean my kitchen a little bit and to bring over the cake they didn't want. 2 police cars pulled up in front of my parents' house, where they escorted me and my dad down the street to my house. 1 officer stayed outside with us, while 2 others went inside to investigate. It felt like 15 minutes before they came back outside and said it was clear. They checked the crawl space, the attic, everything. There was really nothing for me to report, other than the door was left unlocked and I saw the outline of a head upstairs before I ran for it. Still, I didn't feel safe sleeping in there that night, so I went back to my parents' house. Me and my dad are certain that my mom simply forgot to lock the door when she left, as her memory has been getting worse over the past few months. My dad has been stopping her from coming over alone from now on, which makes me both sad but also relieved. Some nights, I still get paranoid that whoever was in my house that night never left, and is still hiding in here somewhere. When I was 19, I worked as a camp counselor at a summer camp. The job would be to entertain and chaperone a large group of kids with a bunch of other counselors for 3 sessions for the summer. That meant 3 different groups of kids would come at different points in the summer. Each group would come for 2 weeks, which meant I was away from home for this job for a total of 6 weeks. By the time the last group came, summer was more than half over, and I was ready to finish this job and get home. At some point during the 2nd week of the 3rd session, and the final week of the job for the season, one of the kids in my group, named Todd, wasn't feeling good, so he wanted to go back to the cabin to go to sleep while everyone else was around the campfire. When we got back to the cabin for 10 to 12-year-old boys, I left Todd to brush up and go to bed. Upon exiting the cabin, a little girl, probably 8 years old, was waiting in front. She wasn't supposed to be in the section, especially not alone at this hour at her age. I asked her where her group was. She didn't answer me.
I asked her what her name was. She said Willa. I asked her what her counselors' names were. She didn't answer. I took her hand and brought her into the front section of the cabin. Then I told her to wait there. I started to run across the camp to the other activity sections, hoping to find the girls' group. When I couldn't find them, I ran straight for the section with the girl cabins. I found one of the female counselors with a small group of 7 to 8-year-old girl campers and asked her if she had any girls named Willa in their group. The counselor was certain there was no one with that name in any of the girls' groups, actually. Next thing I did was run back to the boys' cabin where I left the girl, with plans of bringing her to the front office building. When I got back to the cabin, however, she wasn't there. I went towards the back section by the beds and asked Todd if he'd seen a girl walk in there, to which he looked confused and said no. So now in a panic, I ran outside and looked in the immediate area of the cabin for the girl, when suddenly I heard a girl's scream come from the woods. I was beyond shook. I can't even come up with better words to use for how I was feeling when I heard that scream. I wanted to run for help, but I felt like whatever danger she could be in could be time sensitive, so I ran into the woods calling Willa's name. It didn't return any calls back for a while, and I felt like I was hopelessly running into the dark woods, until finally, after some time, and calling the name Willa constantly, there was a scream echoing through the woods, very close this time. I continued a bit further, and there she was, that little girl named Willa. She was standing straight in front of a tree looking at me, as if she were waiting. I told her to come to me in a quiet voice as I slowly approached her, but then she turned and started running. I didn't know why she was running, but I had to follow her. She was surprisingly fast, but I kept up. I saw her slow down and stop ahead, though my vision of her was intruded by a few trees, as it was the whole time I was chasing her. I stopped and hid behind a tree, thinking maybe I could sneak up on her and grab her if I was quiet enough. And I noticed something in the near distance. It was some small, dim red light waving around behind some foliage. The girl then ran over to the light and apparently ducked down out of sight. I was trying to put the pieces together, just as I saw some larger figure emerge from where the girl had just disappeared to. And this figure was crouch walking in my direction. I was able to put 2 and 2 together and assume this was some kind of trap. So I turned and sprinted all the way back to the campgrounds and ran straight for the main office. I spoke with the camp coordinator, Jackie, told her about the suspicious activity that just took place, and advised that all camp activity should be cut short for the night. Any incident like this would be treated very seriously for the safety of the children and the well-being of the camp's reputation. Authorities had been alerted about suspicious activity on the campground. They came, I helped them with their report, and they left. By morning, everything was back to normal. The season was over before we knew it, and that was that. I have my own theories of what I witnessed in the woods that night. The most logical has to be the possibility that a man was using that little girl, maybe his daughter, as some kind of bait to lure unsuspecting victims into the woods. And what would happen next? I have no idea. I'm glad I didn't find out. I've been through a lot of hellish experiences in my life, but this one takes the cake. It was about 20 years ago, so I was, I believe, around 20 years old. This was way before cell phones and navigation garments. I was working off the books for a media company at the time, who were paying me for my photography and videography skills. I had all of the top quality video equipment for the time, which held to today's standards would be like comparing a Nokia to an iPhone. I was being paid to go out into the wilderness and record hours worth of background footage of lakes, trees, etc. They would use this as stock footage for various documentaries and such. I drove about half an hour to find a good place in rural Maryland to do the shoot. Then I parked my car on a dirt road and hiked for a while, finding a few good shooting locations. It was good for me to get sunset and nighttime shots as well, as different times of day created different lighting for the videos. I figured I had enough, I started packing up my copious amounts of equipment and threw my 2 bags over my shoulders and began walking. And walking. And walking. I started to realize I should have reached the dirt road where my car was by now. There came a time when I had to accept it. I was lost. I had absolutely no way of knowing which way was which. I'd done wilderness shoots before, and never had I run into that problem before, but usually I'd have a compass with me. Not this time. I kept walking for so long, it got to the point that I was letting out little cries to myself in stress, wanting nothing more than to just find my car and go home, feeling absolutely helpless. Eventually, after many hours, I came across a small building. It was an old house that appeared to be abandoned in the middle of the woods, indicated by the vines crawling up the sides of the home, plus the broken glass. Continuing to walk around in the woods in the night was the last thing I wanted to do, and seeking refuge for the night made more sense. I walked up the wooden stairs to the front door, which seemed to have already been broken in. All I had to do was push it with a bit of force and I was inside. It was next to pitch black in there, and every step I took, I felt like I was stepping on rubble or trash. I did, however, manage to find the bedroom of the house, which still had a bed in it, mind you, probably a filthy bed at that, but it beat sleeping in the woods or hiking around any longer in the dark. I shut the door and plopped my stuff on the floor and arranged one of my bags to act as a cushion between me and the actual bed itself. Then I tried my best to fall asleep in this dark, abandoned, foreign location in the middle of the woods. It was surreal, and it was scary. The window in the room was broken, so I could hear the wind and bugs outside. But over that, there was the slightest, and I mean slightest little creak from a few feet away from the bed across this tiny bedroom. I looked up, and even though it was dark, I could vaguely see a closet door in the corner. It was moving. It had to be the draft. It had to be. I was letting my paranoia get the better of me in this freakish situation. But then, over the sound of the bugs and wind, I heard something from inside the room now. It was a gurgling type sound, like a throat noise. I looked at the closet again. Something was coming out from the darkness of the closet. I got up to grab my stuff off the ground. Within arm's reach now, I was staring at someone else in this room in this abandoned house in the middle of the forest. Here's my description of what I saw in the brief moments I was staring at this person. I saw a man wearing a woman's wig with some kind of makeup on his face. As for what he was wearing, I didn't really notice that, but I think it was something dark since I couldn't really see it. I grabbed my bags and started saying I'm sorry as I ran out of the house. I didn't know if this was their house or not at the time, but either way I didn't want any trouble. As I ran away from the house, I heard footsteps tailing behind me at first. I think this is when the adrenaline really kicked in, and I suddenly had this insane amount of energy to keep running until I felt I had escaped. And even after that, I kept running, hopping over logs and rocks and twigs, trying to find a road, any road, with the logic that there's only so much forest left in the state, I'd have to run into a road eventually. And finally, I did. I walked down the road, and within 10 minutes, a car passed, and I hitchhiked my way back to my truck. On my way home, I had time to reflect. That house was absolutely abandoned. The door and all the windows were smashed open, there was trash all over the place. I can't use logic to explain it, because it's not explainable. I am grateful I was unharmed, though. My apartment complex sits in a pretty safe neighborhood, so I guess I'm naturally less on guard as far as break-ins and whatever. There was this one night I'd gotten home late from a bar with friends, and though I wasn't very drunk anymore, I was definitely still tipsy. To give a little context on my apartment layout, it's on the ground level and has 2 doors, a front and back. As I entered, I was in the living room, greeted by my dog Chester. Then I passed the living room to walk down a tiny hallway to my room. Chester followed, though he was acting a little weird. I jumped right into bed. I was exhausted. I fell asleep in minutes, and the next thing I remember is waking up to growling.
I looked at Chester, who was standing up on my bed, looking at the far corner of the room. I sat up to see what he was looking at, but it was too dark. I had to flip on the lamp. That's when I noticed that he was looking at the closet door, which was cracked open just barely. Right away, I felt a pain in my stomach as I feared the worst. I lightly tapped him to get him to shut up for a second, and he looked at me and went silent. I got out from the bed as he watched me tiptoe closer to the closet. If someone was in there, I had to be ready to defend myself. So instead of opening that door right then and there, I hurried to the kitchen to get a knife. Chester followed me. When I got back into my room, I don't know where it came from. I had a huge bout of confidence overcome me, and I rushed open the closet door fully. I was shocked, but also relieved to see no one inside. I called Chester an idiot as I went back to the kitchen to put the knife away. When I got back into the room, I saw Chester looking under my bed, growling again. I bent down to take a look, and there was a man hiding under my bed. We made eye contact for a second, and then I grabbed Chester and ran outside to knock on the neighboring apartment's door. My neighbor opened in his pajamas, and I begged him to let me in after explaining that someone was in my apartment. He let me in immediately and let me use his phone to call the police. The intruder wasn't in the apartment anymore by the time the police came and searched the place. If it weren't for my tiny little chihuahua who couldn't harm a fly, I may not have come out of this in one piece.
I live in a small, peaceful town. I don't live in a place where you have to worry about walking alone at night. I share a one-story house with my sister, but she's hardly ever home. She has another place in Florida that she spends most of her time. There's about 100 to 200 feet between each house on my block, and then there's some woods across the street. I have a daily routine. I get home from work, make dinner, shower, relax a little, then go for a run, come back and have a light snack, then go to bed. It was a work night like any other. I was going for my nightly run, and when I came back to my house, there was a random white van parked across the street. I took notice of it because hardly ever would random cars park on any of these streets. Our little neighborhood has very little through traffic. I looked at it as I walked backwards to my front door, and I could tell there was someone sitting inside of it, though I couldn't see anything regarding what they were doing. I don't know if the glass was tinted or if it was just because it was dark out. Later that night, I was hearing some weird sounds coming from outside. It was like a scraping sound. I looked out my window and called out, "Hello?" and it stopped. I had no idea what it could be, but my first guess was the neighbor doing something in his yard. I went back to whatever I was doing, and that was the night. The following day was a Friday, the last day in my work week. After work, I did proceed with my regular schedule. I went on my nightly run a little earlier tonight since it was Friday and I had plans with some friends. I got back from my run, imagining the van to be there again, but it wasn't this time. I went out with my friends to a comedy club, and I didn't get back until late. I let myself into the house and locked the door. It was a long night and I was feeling tired, so I hurried up with the getting ready for bed process. After turning off the bedside light in my room and laying down, that's when things were finally silent enough for me to pick up on some weird thumping and rustling sounds. I felt like they were coming from inside of the walls. It's only a 2-bedroom house, it's not big. I put my ear up to one of the walls, and indeed heard something going on in there. I knocked on the wall and the noises stopped. This was a cause for concern, as I assumed it was a rodent or a wild raccoon. I went out to the living room, and passing by the windows, I looked outside and saw that white van parked outside again. I opened my front door and stepped out to the front stoop to look at the van. I didn't see anyone sitting in it this time. 2 nights in a row of this now, something was going on. I walked barefoot to the side of my house to look for possible holes in the walls for animals to crawl through. Then I came to the outside crawl space door. It was cracked open, and the lock was snapped off. I hadn't paid attention to this door in weeks. I pulled it open a little more, and without a phone or flashlight in my hands, all I could do was lean inside and squint my eyes in the pitch blackness of the crawl space. I heard the faintest little sounds of pebbles scraping against the concrete floor. At first, my naive mind was thinking it was an animal, till the sounds turned more aggressive and more closely resembled human footsteps marching to the crawlspace door. And then, just barely, I could see a person crouch walking towards me. I slammed the door and twisted the knob, but without a lock it wouldn't do anything. I ran back inside my house and called the police. While on the phone, I instantly attributed the crawlspace door to the scraping sounds I heard the night before. The next time I went to the window while on the phone, the van in the street was gone. Police came and I showed them the crawlspace. We had to use flashlights as the crawlspace doesn't have any lights installed. We found something disturbing. In the left corner, there were cut marks in the roof of the crawlspace as if the intruder was trying to saw his way into the house. The only info I could give them was the white van parked in front of the house. We don't have cameras, nor did I see what he or she even looked like. They never came back though. I'd imagine because I caught on to what was probably supposed to be a silent operation. My family has a summer home in Arapahoe National Forest of Colorado. It's a 7-hour drive from my home. I don't often go with my parents or siblings, if ever. I go alone for the purpose of hunting and detoxing. I've probably been up there a total of 40 times in my life. The last time I went was a few months ago, but I don't really like going alone anymore. Here's why. It was 2017. I just pulled my truck up the old dirt road onto the grass of the property. There's no real driveway, we just park wherever on the grass really. The house isn't huge, it's modest but nice for a vacation home. I parked up next to the front deck. This was in the dead of summer, but the breeze there was still nice and cool. I let myself into the house using the keypad lock. We don't use physical keys in fear of losing or forgetting them. I was the first one there in quite some time, so I had to turn on the electricity and water heater. In the meantime, I unpacked and ate the lunch I brought with me. I also threw away any mouse and bug traps that were left out that caught mice and bugs. It's actually quite a problem in the house. After all of this was done, I started setting up my hunting gear, which my dad and I leave in a big back closet. By this point, the sun was on its way down. It was around 6 o'clock. A laughter from outside caught my attention. I marched from the kitchen to the living room to look out the big window that looked into the woods. I looked into the woods and I didn't see anyone, so I cranked the heavy window open and listened. The laughter belonged to multiple children, like a small group. This was our property though. That meant these kids were trespassing, probably up to no good. I went outside through the back door to the woods, trying to follow the laughter. I kept going deeper into the woods, and the laughter stayed the same distance away from me though. Eventually I gave up because it seemed like the kids were running away anyway. The next day, while posted up in the tower that my dad built for deer hunting in the woods, I heard the sound of those kids laughing again. Noting that meant they were once again on our property, I decided to call my dad and ask what to do. He told me to chase them off the property if I saw them, so I shot around into the air. I forfeited any game for the sole purpose of chasing the kids away, but it worked of course. The sound of the laughing stopped right away. I knew now it would be pointless staying posted up in the tower, so I called it for the day and went back to the house. I wasn't feeling too well anyway. That night I slept with all the windows open to get some air circulating, maybe help me with my headache. Then it came back. The sounds of the children. At this crazy hour, it had to be past like 11 at this point. I climbed up the bed to look out the window. Of course, it was too dark out there. I had enough now, though. I grabbed my Winchester from the closet and a flashlight as well. I didn't have intentions of shooting kids, just scaring them off with a round or two. I went out the back door towards the woods again, where the laughter was coming from. The laughter was louder than any other time before now. Like, it seemed like they were 20 meters away at most. I yelled in a strong, commanding voice to get off my land. I scanned the woods with my flashlight. It wasn't a very powerful one, though. Then, every muscle in my body basically went limp when the volume of the laughter went from 30 to 100 in a matter of half a second. Then something landed on the ground next to me. It was an old-looking speaker. The sounds of kids laughing was blasting through it. I picked it up and threw it back in the woods, then aimed the light back in the woods. At one point, I'm still not sure of it though, but I thought I saw a person standing at the edge of my light. I aimed my Winchester into the air and fired, then yelled a threat like, "Come any closer, the next round goes through your skull." I then ran back inside the back door and locked it. I closed every curtain. I considered calling the sheriff's department, but all the way up here, any police call would take at least half an hour to an hour. I was better off fleeing altogether. As I packed my bag, I heard a smudge on the living room window. I waited a few minutes in an idle position before slightly moving the curtains, revealing something written in blood on the glass. I didn't take the time to read it. I finished packing my bag, took my gun, took a deep breath, and went outside. I locked the door with the code as quickly as possible, then ran for the car as if my life depended on it. I turned the car on and put it in drive before it had time to finish with those startup beeps. I spoke with my dad on the way home. He told me I was right to leave. Anything in the house wasn't worth my life. I stayed at a nearby motel that night, and my dad came the next day. I met him at the house. Whatever was written on that window in blood was wiped completely off. The house wasn't broken into, and we couldn't find the speaker type thing that was thrown at me. We stayed a couple nights, then went home. I don't know who was out there or why they were targeting me. I really hope that blood was animal blood, though. I was home alone one weekend, house to myself. I had a couple friends over the first night, and I stayed up pretty late both nights. I was 14 at the time, just started high school, and my parents had just started trusting me enough to leave the house to myself. This was on a Saturday night. I was out with a couple friends pretty late. When we all decided to call it a night, I walked home by myself. Halfway through my walk home, I noticed the car seemed to be following me. So I started to jog home, and the car started flashing its lights. At this hour of the night, I could only assume potential danger, so I turned my jog into a full-fledged run. I ran all the way to my house and checked outside the windows. Moments later, the car from outside parked in front of the house and someone came out from the car. They started running up to my front door. I started panicking. The doorbell started to ring, and they started pounding on the door aggressively. I suddenly felt like my life was being threatened. I ran to my room, which is on the lower level of the house by the backyard. I tried to get my parents on the phone, but they wouldn't answer. They were definitely asleep. For a 14-year-old boy, I was scared to death. Now the intense knocking moved to my window instead of the front door. I screamed at them to go away, and they yelled something back, but it was muffled. I left my room to hide in my parents' room and call the police. I made a phone call explaining that I was followed home and someone was trying to break into my house. The banging started at my parents' bedroom window now, as if they somehow knew which room I was going to every time. I screamed, "Go away." The 911 dispatcher told me not to do that and to keep quiet and stay hidden, but the person banging on the glass started yelling through the closed window, and now I could hear more clearly what he was saying. He yelled there was a person in my house. Then he yelled someone followed me home and might be inside my house. Ignoring the 911 dispatcher, I went to the window and asked in a loud voice so he could hear me, "What are you talking about?" He yelled at me to call the police and stay locked inside of a room because someone followed me home and went to our backyard. I told the dispatcher exactly what the man yelled to me. She said don't trust him just yet and to stay in a locked room until the police would arrive at my front door. I didn't know whether the things the man was saying were true or not. Not until hearing footsteps outside my parents' bedroom near the living room. The footsteps clonked down the wooden floor of the bedroom hallway. I heard each door in the hall being opened until they got to my parents' bedroom door. The doorknob twisted, but since it was locked, obviously the door couldn't be pushed open. I hid in the closet as the person on the other side of the door started trying to most likely kick the door down, as all I heard were loud bangs. Eventually the bangs stopped. I imagine they gave up. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, but probably because I was in the closet. I was still on the line with the dispatcher. She told me police were outside, to which I suggested the police try entering through the back, as that was apparently the point of entry most likely. They were able to enter through the front door though, as apparently the intruder left through the front. The back door was left ajar after the intruder smashed the glass panel on the door, allowing him to reach in and unlock it. I met the police in the living room. The man who was outside banging on the windows was also there. He told this whole story that as I was walking home, he saw some older man crouching in bush after bush, following me in a manner that conveyed he meant harm. He followed me all the way to my house, as a matter of fact. That's why the guy in the car was following me as well as flashing his lights. I called my mom, who picked up on the third try. I didn't want to call my dad because I was scared of how angry he'd be. I spoke with my mom on speakerphone, with the police listening and contributing reassuring words to my mom. The police dropped me off at a friend's house that night to sleep there, and my parents started driving home that night and got home early the next morning. A police officer parked outside our house for a few hours before driving off. Nothing was stolen at all to our knowledge, and if the intruder didn't break in to rob us, that means he really was just after me, and he came after me in my own house. My friend Keith has an uncle with dementia. Long story short, his uncle usually lives with his grandma, but she was in Florida with some church group for the week, and Keith was going on a business trip, so while he was gone, he hired me to house sit. This included watching after and taking care of his uncle. I'll call him Uncle Nick. Keith would only be gone for 2 days. On the first day of my house sitting, I mostly just hung out in the backyard reading and tanning, or in the living room watching TV. I cooked twice. Each time I made extra food for Uncle Nick, but I never saw him come out of his room upstairs. I went up to knock on his door lightly and tell him I made food. I heard a grunting noise on the other side of the door. I assumed that was his way of acknowledging me. I never actually met his uncle. Oddly enough, we weren't introduced when Keith hired me for this little job. Uncle Nick was fully aware of my being there, at least that's what Keith said. He never left his room to eat while I was in the living room, so I went up to Keith's spare room for the night. I left the door cracked open so I could listen, and I eventually heard a door down the hall opening and unsettlingly quick and heavy footsteps moving down the hall and down the stairs. Seconds later, I heard the same footsteps rush back up the stairs and back to the room. Then the door slammed shut. It was honestly a little unnerving. Hard to explain, just the intensity of his footsteps, like he was avoiding me or something. The next day was pretty similar to the first. I made 2 meals and left the food on the counter for Uncle Nick both times. When I was laying in the backyard again, I came back in to see the plate was empty, so I guess he was really avoiding me. I went back out to tan some more, and when I thought about it, I looked up to the bedroom Nick was staying at, and there he was, looking at me through the window. I think when he noticed me, he ducked down. I felt so uncomfortable that I folded up the blanket and went back inside and up to the spare bedroom. It was okay. One more night of this and I'd be home. I made dinner that night and left him another plate. As I walked up to the spare bedroom, I noticed his bedroom door was open now. First time I'd seen that. Maybe he was becoming less shy. I went to brush my teeth and go to my room for the rest of the night to give him his space. I was having a rough time sleeping though. I just wasn't tired at all. While laying there in the dark, I heard a short creaking sound coming from inside the room, even over the noise of the fan next to me. I sat up and looked around, still able to slightly see in the dark room. I didn't see anything. More specifically, I didn't see Uncle Nick. I was getting paranoid, honestly. Why was I becoming so creeped out by him? I lay back down on my side, facing the wall next to the bed. I ignored the little sounds I thought I was hearing in my head for the most part, but when I heard a very faint groan, I sat up and turned off the fan to listen. I heard breathing. I turned to the far right side of the room by the desk, and there he was, sitting on the desk chair, turned to me. I screamed in fear, and he came up to me going shh and covered my mouth with his hand. In the moment, I thought he was trying to suffocate me, so I pushed him off of me and ran to the nearest bathroom to lock the door. I listened as I heard his manic footsteps rush back to his room and slam the door. My heart was pounding inside my chest. I called Keith and told him about it. He sounded like he wasn't even that shocked. That's the scary thing. He told me it's best I sleep in the bathroom with the door locked. And when he said that, it said to me that his Uncle Nick is potentially dangerous, which scares me even more. I slept maybe 3 hours max that night on the bathroom floor, and in the morning I quickly packed my backpack and waited out in the backyard for Keith to return. He paid me extra for what I had to deal with, and I suggested he get his uncle some serious help, because I think he has more than dementia, and I still don't know what his intentions were that night. My dad once told us a true scary story of his from when he was in his 20s. When he was still living with my grandparents, he lived next door to this older couple in their 60s. One winter, the wife Margie next door went missing. The husband knocked on their door and asked my grandparents if they'd seen her, but unfortunately they hadn't. No one had, apparently. A few days later, my dad was out at the park playing football with friends. That's when it started to snow. They played in the snow for a while until it got to be too much. Then they all went their separate ways back home. When my dad got home, he realized his parents were gone. My dad started the fireplace and went to his room, which was adjacent to the living room, to throw his stuff on his bed. Then he went to take a warm shower. When he got out from the shower, he thought he heard humming from the living room outside the bathroom. He opened the door a crack in his towel and said, "Mom?" The humming stopped, but a creaking sound continued. My dad threw on his clothes in the bathroom and walked out into the living room. There in my grandpa's old rocking sofa chair was Margie from next door. She looked straight at my dad and said, "It was so cold I needed to get warm." My dad ran next door to get the husband, but when the two of them returned to the living room, the sofa chair was empty and Margie was gone. The two of them searched the whole house together, calling her name, but she wasn't there. Now, this much of the story was enough to creep me out already when my dad told it to us. But it didn't end there, and the really scary part didn't happen until the next day, when Margie's dead body was found in the man next door's crawl space, where she apparently tripped and sliced her head open on a sharp object. He only found her because the smell became so unbearable he smelt it from the garage. The thing is, the body was deemed to have been dead for at least 3 days, yet my dad saw her in the living room just the day before. To this day, my dad believes he saw the ghost of Margie in my grandparents' living room that day, and my dad's not one to make stuff like this up. When he first told us this story when I was 9, let's just say I didn't get much sleep that night. There's a lot of Black Lives Matter protesting going on in my area. Now, before I write anything else, I want to disclose that I fully support the Black Lives Matter movement. However, this is my personal opinion that the looting and rioting are not okay, and anyone participating in those acts should not be associated with the peaceful protesters. But unfortunately, mixed in with the peaceful protesters are the looters and rioters hiding in plain sight. A few nights ago, many stores and houses in the town next to mine were broken into and robbed, and a lot of car windows were smashed. There were rumors from the cops in our friend group that our town would be a target the next night. We stayed up a little later than usual the next night for that reason, and while watching a movie together as a family, we had to mute the TV when we heard yells from outside. We checked out the window, and a large group of young men with masks on were parading down the street. They weren't holding protest signs or anything. They were just being loud and, by the sound of it, cursing a lot. But they didn't appear to be damaging any property, so we went back to our movie. Then after that, my parents went to sleep. I stayed up later in my room playing a video game with the headset on so I could talk to my friends. Eventually, I grew bored and tired and turned the system off and went downstairs to get a glass of water for bed. As I passed the little half stairway to our den on my way to the kitchen, I looked down there and saw something big sitting on the carpet by the window. I went down the stairs, and when I picked it up, I realized what it was. It was the glass of the window, broken, but all taped up as if to make the glass shattering easier or quieter. I ran to my parents' room to get my dad. When he saw it, he called the police. The response time was outrageously long. My dad said we were lucky the line wasn't busy, as the 911 calls recently by us have skyrocketed. When the police came to search the house, it didn't seem anything was stolen or anyone was in the house. They had to respond to another call within 20 minutes, but they said to call back if something else happened. My dad and I opted to sleep in the den for the rest of the night to prevent anything else from happening, so my mom went back upstairs. Time rolled on slowly, but eventually I think my dad fell asleep. A large rift of wind hit me in the face through the opening where glass used to be, causing me to open my eyes and look at the window. No one was out there, but for some reason I thought I heard something come from upstairs, so I went up the half flight of stairs thinking maybe it was my mom. When I got to the kitchen, I continued to hear noises from above me, so I walked upstairs, and the noises were still coming from above me. What else was above? The attic. I went to the upstairs storage room which had the attic door. I quietly opened it, revealing the short stairway to the attic. This is when the noises stopped. I didn't flick the light switch on, I just tiptoed halfway up the stairs to listen. That's all. The heavy silence was terrifying, considering I knew I was hearing noises from up here just a second ago. I waited on one of the middle steps to hear something. Then I felt the hairs on my head being moved. Someone's fingers started running through the curls in my hair as I heard this deep, short cackling sound. I let out a cry for help from my dad, as all the confidence immediately left my body and I was overcome with horror. I ran out from the attic to meet my dad halfway down at the kitchen. He didn't go up to the attic, he once again called the police instead, while we heard shuffling and thumps from above us. The cops once again came, and upon entering the attic with their guns drawn, were able to locate someone. They came out of the attic with some creepy old man with a mask on, looking at my family and I and laughing as he walked out. When the cops asked him in the back of the car what he was planning on doing, he simply admitted right away that he's seen all the looting going on the news, that he wanted to join in on the fun. He made his way to our attic because he said that's where people store their most valuable possessions. Based on the way the man spoke and acted in general, you could tell he was certifiably insane. He told the cops that he was alone. Oddly enough, he answered all their questions no problem. But once again, this guy clearly had some screws loose or missing entirely. Feeling him brush his hand through my hair like that will probably haunt me for a long time, maybe even life. And one thing is for sure, I don't feel safe going in that attic anymore.
When me and my troublemaking friends were 13 years old, one of the many rowdy and mischievous things we would do would be Saturday night ding-dong ditch sessions. 10 years ago, we all lived on the same block in a typical suburban neighborhood. At the time, there were a lot less houses and more woods though. I'm going to make up names for my friends for the case of this story. There was Mark, James, and Matt. Either Mark or James were usually the ones to go up to the houses and ring the bells. Matt and I, on the other hand, would usually find hiding spots right away. We hit about 5 or 6 houses. I remember all of the men who answered the doors gave pretty much the same reactions. They'd step out onto the stoop, one or two would yell something, and then they'd walk back inside. For a couple of houses, we'd ring the bell again for a better reaction. One guy yelled he was calling the cops the second time, so when he shut his door, we all booked it down the street and went to the next block over. As I mentioned, 10 years ago in this neighborhood, there were patches of wood sitting where houses sit today. On the next block over, there were a few patches of wood surrounding some of the houses, and the houses on this block seemed to be more unkempt. The first house on the block was across the street from the patch of woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. The house was kind of run down looking, tall grass, a ratty old car with a cover on it in the driveway, and overall just a small house. Mark went up to ring the bell. He barely had time to make it across the street before the door opened. It was another man to answer the door. This guy really big, about 6 foot and stocky build. Unlike the others, he was furious immediately. He walked around his whole front yard checking the bushes, yelling threats. We all laughed as we always did. Eventually, he finally went back inside. Mark waited a few minutes, checked the windows, and then ran back up the stoop to ring the bell again. I didn't envy him with this house. I would not be bold enough to ring that man's bell again. Mark knew he probably didn't have as much time, so he ran to the side of the house and out of sight. The door opened much quicker this time, and this time the man came out with a rifle in his hand. We all looked at each other, simultaneously going, "Oh shit," under our breath. The man checked all the places he checked before, and then a few extra places this time, like behind his car, behind a couple trees, and then he walked to the center of his lawn and just stood there, as if he were thinking. He looked around, and then his head stopped as he was facing us in the woods. Me, Matt, and James looked at each other. We ducked lower in hopes that he didn't see us. After 10 seconds of staring in our direction, the man went back into his home. And then, we saw him appear at his front window, standing still like a statue, looking in our direction in the woods once again. We saw Mark creeping back over to the man's front door, but there was nothing we could do. We were too afraid to move or yell anything. Mark rang the bell once again and ran for it. The man didn't move though, at least not for another minute. Then he turned and walked away from the window. We didn't see Mark again, but we were still too nervous to move or say anything. The next thing I remember, we heard Mark's voice from across the street yelling, "Run." We didn't understand until we heard someone running up from behind us, realizing upon turning our heads that it was the man from across the street with his rifle in hand, pointed at us. We ran like little prey from a predator to Mark, who was waiting for us across the street. We ran for blocks until we were sure we lost him. Mark explained that he yelled when he saw the man sneaking across the street into the patch of woods with his gun. We didn't report him or any of what happened. We just told a few friends and that was it. Luckily the house was many blocks from us, so we never really had to pass it again. I lived in a house from hell for a couple of weeks. I was a college student and my parents were paying for a house for me to live in. I'm spoiled, I know. Well, the house was modest, nothing fancy or huge, and I was happy with it. Well, for the first few days anyway. Then things quickly started getting strange. On a rainy Saturday with nothing to do, I was watching TV for a few hours. That was when I heard a scrape on my living room floor. I looked around the room thinking an animal got into the house or something. I sat back down and resumed watching TV. That was the first weird occurrence. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night, which made for an excuse to not go out. I stayed in watching more TV in the living room. I perked up when I thought I heard something from the kitchen. Laughably, I took a pillow with me as, I guess, some sort of weapon and walked over to the kitchen doorway. There, in the middle of the dark kitchen, was a box of Cheerios on the floor, spilling out hundreds of the tiny O's. I had no idea how that could have happened. Nevertheless, I dropped the pillow and began cleaning up the Cheerios off the floor. As I was doing so, I heard a creak, like the sound weak areas of a wood floor make when someone steps on them. It was by the kitchen table. I looked up, but nobody was there. I knew I was going crazy now. Every little sound must have been making me paranoid. I cleaned the Cheerios and went back to watching TV. The thunder outside was getting louder as the bulk of the storm seemed to be passing overhead. Yet I found it to be strangely relaxing. That was the last thing I remember, appreciating the sound of the storm outside, before waking up from what seemed to be an hour-long doze. The TV was still on, but that wasn't what woke me. I remember believing I woke up to a bang or thud from downstairs. Regardless, I turned off the TV and marched upstairs to bed. The next day was normal, as was the day after that. It wasn't until the next gray, rainy day that strange things started happening again. I woke up in my bed that morning feeling like I had been drinking all night the night before. I felt sicker than I'd ever felt with any hangover before. I didn't do much walking around that day. The gloomy dark weather only made me more bedridden. I left the TV in my bedroom on all day just as background noise, with a garbage pail by my side in case I had to puke. At midday, I muted the TV after hearing sounds coming from above me. The attic. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic was built over that bedroom. It wasn't just one thud I heard, it was 3 or 4. I managed to get out of bed, despite the fact that every time I moved I wanted to puke. I pulled the string to the attic door down, took one of my old baseball bats with me, and climbed up the steps. I pulled the light switch down to light up the attic. There were a few old boxes that must have belonged to the previous owners scattered about, but I couldn't see any living things to produce those noises. I climbed back down quickly because I was kind of scared of that attic. There were no more noises. Until that night. I woke up to, at first, what I thought was thunder, still feeling a bit sick. The familiar sound of a thud from up in the attic gave me chills. I pulled the string to the attic door back down, took my baseball bat once again, and climbed up the stairs. I made myself angry and screamed in the most intimidating voice I could, but before I could turn the light on, I heard the sound of a child giggling in the pitch-black attic. Words cannot describe the feeling of weightlessness, the feeling of my insides dropping inside of my body, the fear that I felt. The word fear is not enough to describe what I felt at that moment. I was out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. I explained everything the best I could. My parents saw how emotional I was about this, and in a weird sense, I think they believed me. I packed all of my things up with my parents the next day, and moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal. I used to work as a maid for some old lady for a couple of weeks when I was 20. She had a really big yet old house on a property that could have been beautiful if she had actually taken care of it. She had 2 acres of land surrounded by woods in 3 directions and the road on the other. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of wood, and the interior was really dark. She would often keep the blinds shut in some rooms for reasons I didn't understand. I would sometimes open the blinds to let some sunlight in, only to find that she'd have shut them by the next time I entered the room. She lit some rooms by candle, which made the house seem even more prehistoric from the inside. To top it off, the wood floors were creaky as hell just about everywhere in the house. The woman's name was Mel. She was around 70 years old. The kind of work Mel would have me do would be mostly physical stuff that she couldn't do very well anymore, like sweeping, dusting, cleaning dishes, doing laundry, sorting mail, and other things of that sort. One weekend, Mel asked me to sleep there for a night or 2. The house had like 4 bedrooms, yet she lived alone, so it wasn't an issue. Well, this takes place over the course of a Friday, and technically a Saturday as well. I arrived as per usual on Friday, speaking very few words to Mel. I dropped my backpack full of my clothes and cosmetics onto the bed in the bedroom that I was going to be sleeping in. As I turned to the door, I saw Mel standing by the doorway. She had a creepy way about her, and this entrance was no exception. She didn't say hello, which wasn't as weird as it sounds. She just instructed me to clean the bedroom right away. After that, she just told me to simply straighten up the whole house, and then she went upstairs. I didn't see her for the rest of the day, but I would occasionally hear her walking around upstairs in her bedroom. It was weird, she would seem to walk back and forth. There were no TVs in this house, so I didn't know what she could have been doing. One thing that I found bizarre was how protective she was of her basement. She made it clear it was completely off limits and she didn't want me going down there. Nighttime came and I went to bed early. This was before smartphones were a thing, so I didn't even know what time it was. It was probably 9 or 10 o'clock though. For the first few hours everything was peaceful, however I still had trouble falling asleep given that it was the most uncomfortable bed I'd ever been in. It felt like hours later that I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floors. It sounded like Mel was passing my room really slowly. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but then she stopped outside my door this time. I sat up and listened. I could hear the creaking from behind the door of Mel standing there, and it was starting to creep me out. She finally walked away. I heard her go down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and close from downstairs. I had a feeling it was the basement door. It was a while later that I heard the door open and close again, and then heavy, slow footsteps coming up the creaky stairs. The footsteps once again came to my door, then stopped. I sat up once again to listen, and I could hear creaks of pressure on the floor outside the door, and then I heard the doorknob start to turn. I laid back down and pulled the sheets over me and pretended to be asleep. I heard Mel take a few steps into the room, pause, and then leave. She went back to her room and shut the door. I was a bit disturbed. This was very bizarre behavior. I waited about half an hour before deciding I had to see what was in that basement. I got out of the rickety bed, tiptoed to the door, and then tiptoed down the stairs the best I could. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the lights, and crept down the stairs. I made it to the bottom step, and held in the urge to scream. There were 2 old wooden chairs dead center in the basement, and there were 2 of what I could only describe as decaying corpses with wigs on them sitting in them. The sight of a bug crawling on one of them made me want to puke even more. I brought myself to walk deeper into the basement, closer to the corpses. I had to make sure they were real. Both of the corpses had men's wigs on them. The bigger of the 2 also had a beret on. I don't know much about corpses or their rate of decaying, but I'd say these corpses were both almost a year old. I felt like my heart stopped momentarily when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs on the first floor. I couldn't make it to the light switch. I had no time. I hid behind one of the couches in the basement as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down one creaky stair at a time. I had my hands covering my mouth as I heard Mel reach the last stair. I heard her whisper my name. For half a second, I looked around the couch and saw Mel halfway across the basement already with a big kitchen knife in her hand. I knew she would be too slow to catch me, so I ran for it to the stairs. She screamed my name and followed as fast as she could. When I made it to the first floor of the house, I ran upstairs to the bedroom I was sleeping in to grab my backpack. By the time I ran back downstairs, Mel was at the top basement step. I ran out the front door and to my car. I turned it on, caught my breath, looked to the front door of the big old house, and saw Mel standing there. I drove off the huge property and down the road, making it back home within 10 minutes. Fortunately, I never gave Mel any of my information, such as my address or my phone number, so she was never able to contact me again. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses belonged to her dead husband that she'd mentioned twice to me. As for the other, smaller corpse, I have no idea, but regardless, it was a disturbing scene to witness, and something was way off about that woman.
live in a small town called Julian in California. I had started renting an apartment in some guy's 2-family house. I was browsing Craigslist daily for some cheap furniture to fill the apartment with, or maybe even free furniture if I was lucky. After a week of looking for specific items like a living room couch and TV stand, I stumbled across an ad titled in all capitals, "Giving away Maplewood TV stand, mint condition." The ad obviously caught my eye, so I clicked it in a heartbeat, with the first thing I checked being the date of posting. It said it was posted a couple hours ago. This was a very good sign. The ad had a picture of the stand too. It looked pristine. The description gave an explanation as to why the owner was giving it away. Apparently her boyfriend was going away to the military and didn't have room to store a lot of his furniture, nor did he have time to sell it, and she would be moving back with her parents. There was a number attached to the ad which said call or text. I shot the man a text expressing serious interest in the stand. First thing I noticed was the green text, meaning he didn't also have an iPhone. That was always annoying to see because usually that meant the person would take longer to respond and I couldn't see when they were typing. However, the person got back to me surprisingly fast. She introduced herself as Anna and said I could come take a look at that stand the same night at 9 when she would get home from work, if I'd like to. I got back to her within 10 seconds saying, yeah, absolutely. She sent me her address, I thanked her, and she didn't respond after that. Come 8 o'clock, I sent her another text just to confirm that I could still come. She didn't answer. By 8:30 I was getting a little concerned and antsy, so I decided to call her. It rang 5 times, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a voicemail, but she finally texted me back a few seconds after I called her. She said you can come now. So I put the address into the GPS, hopped in my car, and off I was to the destination. I pulled up to the house and knocked on the door since she said don't ring the doorbell. I gave the door 3 sets of knocks to no avail. I tried calling her, again she didn't pick up, but after the call didn't go through, she sent another text, telling me to just let myself in. I stood there for a second and read her text over and over at least 3 different times, before responding back, is there a problem? I thought it was weird that she was telling me to let myself in. She didn't respond to that text though, so after a few seconds of thinking it over, I grabbed the doorknob and pushed open the door. It made a very distinct and alerting sound, so I was positive Anna could hear it from wherever she was. I shut the door. It was on the darker side in the house, mainly because it seemed like a lot of the curtains were shut. It also had a very distinct, mildewy, cottony smell. I heard a voice call out from upstairs telling me to come up. I said, alright, be right there. But her voice sounded weird. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Halfway up the stairs, I called up, Anna, right? She replied back, yup. Again, her voice sounded odd. I got to the top of the stairs, and there were 2 sides of the hallway I could go down. I playfully called out, which side? With a slight laugh in my voice, even though deep down I was finding the situation incredibly sketchy. Anna's voice came from the left side, from beyond an open bedroom door. I walked to the doorway and stopped. I didn't enter the room though it was a massive room mostly void of furniture. I poked my head into the room and didn't see anyone. Anna? I said. No answer. I was already inching back away from the doorway. Anna, I said one more time. This time she replied, over here, just come inside. But it sounded like she was right behind the open door, and now I was realizing what was off about her voice. It wasn't a she at all. I was 100% sure it was a man pretending to be a woman. I said I forgot something in my car, I'll be right back. I turned for the stairs. That's when the door pulled open completely with force. But I was already on my way down the stairs before I could see who opened the door. I got to the bottom of the stairs, and I heard in a suddenly deep, haunting yell, come back. I opened and slammed the front door shut behind me, and when I got to my car, I never felt more relieved in my life. I drove down the street not looking back at that house. I blocked that number I was given as soon as I got home, and when I went online to report the Craigslist ad, it was already taken down. I figured I'd leave well enough alone. It was not my problem anymore, and I would never go back to that house again, nor concern myself with it. It's still definitely a haunting memory to look back and hear that voice as I was walking up those steps, and behind that door. What would have happened if I wasn't wise enough to run away? I'm sharing this life experience of mine with the internet as a public service announcement to be careful on Craigslist or any similar websites. I happen to be browsing the for sale section of Craigslist trying to find a used laptop. One listing really got my attention, some Dell touchscreen laptop for $250. It looked like it was in good shape with very few minor cosmetic imperfections. I texted the owner, who introduced himself as Dave, and told me I could come pick it up that same night. He offered to meet halfway somewhere so that I wouldn't have to drive all the way out to his place. I live in the countryside, so he lived a solid 10 miles away, which would equate to a 20 to 25 minute drive. Since there aren't many notable places near either of us, we agreed to meet at a 7-Eleven parking lot. I got there at the agreed upon time, which was 10 p.m. sharp. I waited around for a few minutes, then I decided I was going to give him a call. But just as I took my phone out of my pocket to call him, his name came up on my phone. He was calling me. I picked up, skipping the hello, and just said, "Dave, what's going on?" There was a loud background noise on his end, maybe from his driving. There was an initial moment of silence before he started talking. He said he wouldn't be able to make it all the way to 7-Eleven because his car was making weird noises and he didn't want to go too far from home. So he pulled over to the side of the road off some side street. But when we say side streets out here, we don't mean side streets surrounded by buildings or houses. Side streets out here usually mean roads with no streetlights and surrounded by forest or farms. He gave some bizarre description of where he was. There was no way I'd be able to find it ordinarily, so I had him send me his location through his phone. He really was just parked on the side of some side road somewhere. I really didn't know if I was comfortable going at this point. It seemed way too suspicious. I'd heard all about those Craigslist horror stories before, and this seemed like the cliche build-up to one. Against my better judgment, I started driving over to Dave's location anyway. About 5 minutes of driving later on some completely pitch-black road, I eventually saw the reflection of someone's taillights parked on the side of the road. So it had to be him. I pulled up behind the car in the grass next to a large cornfield but kept the car running. I turned my headlights off for a second, and it literally became blackness in every possible direction, so I turned the headlights back on. Weird though, I didn't see any light from his car, not even the light from a phone. I called him again. He picked up on the first ring and said he had to run into the crops to take a quick piss, and to just get into his car so that when he gets back he could quickly show me his laptop. He hung up before I could even get my response in. This was too weird for me. I really didn't know what to do. I guess I figured I'd step out of the car and just wait behind the door for this Dave person to come out. He said he went into the crops, so I kept my eyes on the right side of the road by the crops. What a strange place to have any kind of exchange other than a drug deal. It didn't seem right at all. I stood right by my car door for the longest time, easily 2 or 3 minutes. There was no way he was peeing for that long. It was starting to seem like it was time to go. I'd give him another 30 seconds, I figured. In the final moments of my waning patience standing there, I thought I heard brushing around coming from the crops. I kept doing double takes from one side of the crops to the other. "Dave?" I yelled. The brushing sounds in the crops faded away, but a crackling leaf or two from behind my car made me turn to see someone sneaking up on me from behind my car. Exactly what I feared would happen, but that didn't make it any less horrific as I jumped into my car and floored it before the door was even fully shut. I literally loved myself for thinking to leave the car running. If I had turned it off, I may not have escaped in time. Deep down, I kinda knew the situation was far too suspicious to be real. But really, do any of us ever expect things like this to happen? These things are only supposed to happen in horror movies. You're not actually supposed to experience them for yourself. I guess it just remains a story to tell friends and family for years to come. It was 2011. I had to sell my old bicycle since I had recently got a new one. It wasn't a piece of junk, so I figured I could get a couple $100 for it. I had never used Craigslist before, so I had to have my son show me how to use it. He basically put the whole ad together for me and showed me how to actually post it. He listed my phone number so that anyone who was interested could text or call me. The ad was up for a few days with no bites, and I was becoming impatient. I think after 3 days, I finally got a text from someone late in the day showing interest in coming to buy the bike. He got right down to it actually in his first text, saying he wanted to come get the bike as soon as possible. I told him he could come right now and included my address. He said he'd be over within half an hour. I was happy to potentially be getting this bike off my mind finally. I was actually home alone. I don't fully remember what my family was doing. I think my wife and younger son had gone out shopping while my older son just went out with his friends. But you get the point, I was alone. I was sitting in my living room watching TV. It was dark out by now when I heard a car pull up in front of the house outside. I looked out the window and watched as 3 grown men got out of the car. Right off the bat, that screamed overkill. Why would anyone need to take along 2 other people to go check out a bicycle? One of them rang the bell. They had to have seen me standing by the window, so they knew I was there. So I opened the door, and the man standing in front of the other 2 reached out and shook my hand. His name was Jeffrey, or at least that's what he claimed. He was a big dude. You wouldn't have to look at him twice to know he lifted weights. He also had a really thick beard and deep voice. He didn't introduce his 2 friends though, who were just standing behind him looking at me with blank expressions. They weren't exactly tiny men either. As I was mid-sentence telling them let's go around back, Jeffrey cut past me and into my house, saying, "Which way to the bike?" His 2 friends followed. The idea of making sure they didn't enter my house was clearly out the window. So I rushed in front of them and led them down the half stairs to the back door. Jeffrey and one of his friends came out back with me, while his 3rd friend asked me where the restroom was. I paused for the longest time. How was I about to let this random guy go use my bathroom while I was out here with his 2 friends? But as I looked at his 2 friends who were staring at me, I submissively gave him directions to my bathroom. As that man disappeared into my house, I went to the shed to grab the bicycle. On my walk to and from the shed fetching the bike, all I was thinking was, what did I just get myself into? So I showed Jeffrey the bike. He started analyzing every little detail of the bike, like things no one should ever even think to analyze on a bike. For example, some of the spokes may have been slightly bent or the reflector had scuff marks on it. I was so busy answering his questions and trying to defend the condition of the bike from his remarks that I didn't even think of that man who had supposedly been in my bathroom for almost 10 minutes. I told the 2 of them to keep checking out the bike. I'd be right back to fetch something. I went inside and checked both the bathrooms, the one on the 1st floor and the one upstairs. Both of them were empty though. Just then, I heard people walking around and talking in my living room downstairs. Then, what sounded like Jeffrey calling my name. I heard them coming up the stairs. Jeffrey said something along the lines of, "We just want to talk to you. You can relax." When I say my heart was racing, that's not an understatement. I actually thought that night was going to be the night of my death. I quietly shut the bathroom door and locked it, keeping the lights off, however. I dialed 911 on my phone and whispered as quietly as I could to the operator to send police right away, or I could be dead within 10 minutes. She wanted me to remain calm and to try my best to explain the situation quietly. After explaining, she told me it was good that I was in a locked room, and to wait there until the cops showed up. Footsteps came up to the bathroom door and stopped. Then someone tried the door handle. When they realized it was locked, one of them said in a low voice, "He's in there." I told the operator they found me. She said to stay where I was. After a few seconds of silence on the other end, there was a frighteningly loud bang on the door. And then another and another. They were trying to kick the door down. I screamed the cops are almost here, and then the kicking stopped. I heard them whispering to each other, and then I heard them stomping down the stairs. I didn't leave the bathroom until the cops showed up. I was missing a lot of things, like my wallet which was on the kitchen counter, a couple watches, my iPad, and of course, the bike that was in the backyard. The cops told me to just be grateful that I wasn't killed, which I was, but how could I be happy really after this? The cops said given that they were trying to break into the bathroom, they were most likely going to kill me, which scares the hell out of me to think about. That was the one and only time I ever used Craigslist.
It was the summer of 2012. I have a late birthday, so I was still 15 when all my friends were 16. They all had jobs for the summer, but nobody would hire me because I was only 15. I started looking for off-the-books jobs on Craigslist. I found an ad titled, "Looking for House Cleaning Services, Paying $10 an Hour." The ad had 2 pictures of the house, one outside and one inside. It was a typical middle-class house. He lived in the next town over. The only way to contact him was by email, so I emailed him telling him I was only 15 years old and was willing to clean his house for $10 an hour. He responded in 10 minutes, telling me his work schedule and when he would need me to be available. I told him that was okay, and then he asked me if I had means of transportation to get there every day. I didn't even realize that my mom wouldn't be able to drive me every day. Oddly, he offered to give me a lift to and from every single day. He said he worked close, so coming home to give me a ride wouldn't be a problem. I agreed without even asking my mom, so the man asked for my address. I gave it to him, and he said he would be over at 8:30 a.m. on Monday to pick me up. Come Monday, I met him outside. He drove a black 05 Nissan Maxima. He himself had a black beard and a Mets hat on. He didn't seem dressed ready to go to work, but I didn't think much about that. He introduced himself as James and then dropped me off and gave me the key. He told me to just straighten everything out and such. Then he drove off in a hurry. I found it really weird that he trusted me, a 15-year-old he had never met, to be in his house alone. His house wasn't even too messy. All I did was just fold some clothes, wash some dishes, and used a hand vacuum to clean some of the carpets. The only problem, it was extremely hot in the house, even hotter than outside. It seemed all the windows were sealed shut, and I didn't want to turn on the AC without permission. This went on for 6 hours before he came back, handed me $60, and dropped me off back home. He seemed extremely nice, and I felt I had lucked out finding that ad. This went on for a good 2 weeks, and my mom was okay with it since James was actually paying me. Then, one Friday night, I woke up feeling really thirsty, so I got up to get some water. I looked out my window, and I saw somebody standing there looking into my room. I screamed, and my parents came running over, but the person outside took off before they got there. The next time I went in, it was at least 100 degrees outside. I asked James if I could turn on the AC, but he said it was broken. He told me to just take off my clothes if I got hot. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was serious. I felt really uncomfortable after that. He dropped me off, and I did the same work that I had been doing. It was at least 105 degrees in the house. I had to work shirtless and constantly go outside where it was just a little cooler. The day dragged on, but I just barely made it through. The next day, on the way to his house, James told me that he had the day off from work. He told me he would just help me out. I was not happy to hear this. I would rather just be alone in the house. He seemed to slowly follow me into whatever room I went to clean. I eventually had to go to the bathroom, so I ran upstairs and made sure he wasn't following me. But in the bathroom, I made a shocking discovery. Up in the corner of the room, I found a small camera pointing from out of the wall, just barely visible. I scanned the room for more, and sure enough, there was one in the bottom corner as well. I started searching the whole bathroom for more cameras. I checked under the sink, but what I found was much worse. There were 2 huge stacks of VHS tapes, each one with a sticky note attached with someone's name on it. The one on the top was my name. I almost threw up then and there. I had to find a way to get home safely. James then knocked on the door, asking if I was alright. I said I wasn't feeling good, and asked if he could drive me home. He said okay. I stepped outside, and he told me he had to go as well, so he stepped into the bathroom. For the first half of the car ride, he didn't say anything to me, and the road he was taking me on wasn't familiar. In fact, I noticed that the direction we were heading in was the complete opposite of my house. Where are we going?" I asked. He looked at me and said, "What were you doing in the bathroom?" I started to panic. I didn't answer, so he asked again in a much angrier voice. We were stopped at a traffic light, so I took that opportunity to unlock the door and escape the car. I ran away from sight before calling my mom, crying into the phone, telling her to pick me up. She came over as soon as possible. She immediately reported James, and the police found the tapes under her sink. Some of the tapes contained much worse things than kids just cleaning the house. The scariest thing, some of the kids seen in the tapes are still missing to this day. He was arrested and tried for child pornography, kidnapping, and some other charges. I'm happy I jumped out of that car, because I don't know where he was taking me. This happened about 3 months ago. Me and my roommate decided on getting a used couch, so I thought Craigslist would be a great place for used furniture. I scrolled through about 3 pages before finding a black leather couch. It was in really good condition, and it had a really good price, around $200. I told myself this was too good to be true, and man, I should have listened to myself. We arranged a price, and the guy told me to meet him at his place over email. My roommate was out working overtime, so I had to go alone. The address was a little ways out of town. The house was surrounded by trees. You had to go through the drive-thru to be able to see it. I got out of my car and knocked on the door. This house was different. It was small and wooden, and it looked pretty eerie. When I knocked the 3rd time, I heard creaks on the wood floor coming from inside. Anyone could tell it was footsteps, but it sounded like they were tiptoeing. Then, I heard a faint, muffled voice through the door. Hey, are you the couch guy? But they sounded pretty rushed. So I responded, yes I am. He said back, okay, come around back, the couch is there. I felt a little weirded out by it, but I brushed it off. When I came around back, I saw something that I won't forget. I saw 4 tall men dressed in black robes with their hands together, and in front of them was a pit with a hatch and chain on it. Then I heard the same voice say, "Where's your friend?" I booked it out of there and frantically shoved the key in my car and started it. I looked out the mirror and saw the front door fly open. I shifted into first and floored it out of there. The thing that makes me uneasy to this day is that in the emails, I never told him I had a roommate. I was about 12 years old. I was looking for some craft storage since I got a lot for Christmas. The ones at the stores were really pricey, so me and my 27-year-old sister looked for some on Craigslist. We found someone offering a huge tote for only $10. That would mean getting a $90 discount, so we checked it out. The person lived relatively close to us, so we gave the guy our email. He emailed us within an hour and asked where we should meet. I said we should meet at Dollar Tree since it was a short walk away. He, to my surprise, asked to meet at my home. I lived in an apartment, so that would be inconvenient, so I said that we lived farther away. He said he could drive, but we said no. So we eventually said it was okay to meet at Dollar Tree, but he could only meet up at 9 p.m. I said that's okay, even though it would be dark by then. He said to meet up today. My sister worked the night shift tonight, so she said I could walk there and back and to just bring my wagon so I could just put the tote in it. She gave me $10 and I started walking at 8:30. I arrived just on time and I saw an old knocked up 06 Kia. I assumed it was him, so I yelled, "Hey, got the tote?" He got out of his car and said he left it at home. He asked if I wanted to take a drive with him to his house. I said I can't because it wasn't okay with my family. He said he would drive me home, and I firmly said no. He said if I came with him that I could get the tote for free. I got a very uneasy feeling. He said, "Hey, your address is 234 Letter Road, right?" My heart dropped into my stomach. I got freaked out and ran all the way home. I got home and ran upstairs like a demon was chasing me. I got in my room and locked all the doors and windows. I also covered them with black clothing and such. That night I was shaking like crazy. And then, I heard a hefty man coming up the stairs. Almost no one on my floor was up this late, and no hefty man lived there. I heard a voice, and I almost fainted. "Hey, you still want that tote? It's down in my car. Come help me get it." I almost puked and fainted. I looked through the peephole to see the man's back facing my door. I watched him turn around, and I covered the peephole with a black shirt I had laying around from before. The doorknob started to wiggle. I went under the sink cabinet and was silent as a worm. He started to try to kick the door down, and eventually he did. I felt like I was ready to die. I grabbed an old broom that was sitting in the cabinet. The kicking down of the door woke up my neighbors, who came running in with a baseball bat. My neighbor whacked the guy in the face with the bat, and the guy fell to the floor. I got out with the broom and gave the man a wimpy whack before he stood up and tried to grab me. I physically jumped down the stairs and ran down the street to my sister's work like I was going to die, and I thought I was. I ran to the nurse's station and started to have a breakdown. I was crying and almost throwing up, and the nurses looked at me like I was just raped or something. I told them that a man was following me and was going to kill me. They got my sister and called the police. It turned out he was a serial rapist. Me and my sister moved, and she went away to college. When you decide to use Craigslist, make sure you deal local, and if something seems too good to be true, it usually is. I was 20 years old, still driving my grandpa's old Buick that he handed down, and I hated it. I wanted to drive something cooler and something more age-appropriate. Well, I was making decent money, and I wanted to buy a Mustang, so I started searching Craigslist. And within a week, I found something that seemed unbelievable. A 2013 blue Mustang GT convertible, manual transmission, no accident history, with only 32,000 miles, and the shockingly low price of $16,000. I saw the ad was just posted 4 minutes ago, so I knew I had to act fast. I called the number listed, but it just went to voicemail. I called again, and this time on the 4th ring, a man picked up the phone. I told him I was interested in the car, and he started laughing and joking about how he had just listed it a few minutes ago. He honestly sounded almost too normal and friendly. He gave me his address, and I told him I'll be over at 6 to check it out. After hanging up and realizing this guy sounded normal, I was just so excited to think that I had just found such a good deal. I GPS'd the location. It was a long drive, about an hour. It took me far away from the suburbs that I was used to. The GPS said 2 minutes remaining in the drive, and I was kind of confused. The area I was in was very rural and poor. I pulled up to what the GPS said was the house. It was a shitty rundown old thing. I noticed there was no Mustang anywhere in sight. I felt uncomfortable with even getting out of the car. In fact, I just sat there looking at the house for a good 5 minutes, trying to decide if I should even go and knock on the door. An hour isn't by any means a short drive, but when something seems as sketchy as this seemed, you would understand. I saw the blinds from the window begin to shake, and then the front door opened, and a man, probably in his 50s, came outside. He gave me a wave and a smile. He actually looked somewhat normal. I turned the car off and went out to greet him. I asked him where the car was, and he said it was in the garage. He told me to follow him back inside. I didn't know why he was leading me into his house instead of the garage, but I went anyway. He made sure to shut the door behind me, even though I was going to myself. I was able to get a good look of his house, and I must say, it smelled disgusting, and it didn't have much, if any, furniture. He led me down a small flight of stairs and to a door. I heard some noises coming from beyond the door. The man just explained that it was his friend working on the car. That seemed weird. I also began to hear creaking coming from upstairs, as if someone was walking around. He looked up and said that must be his wife. I found it weird that he had to explain these noises. I wouldn't have thought it was weird otherwise. He finally opened the door, and I got a quick glimpse of his garage. It was completely empty. I took a look at the man, and as he stared back at me, I knew it was time to go. I didn't say anything, I just turned around and ran for the door, but somebody was standing there blocking it. I offered to give them all the money in my wallet to let me go. And then the first guy walked into the room with some sharp metal tool in his hand. I don't know what it was called, but I fled from the room in the opposite direction of the front door and thankfully found the back door. I fled into the backyard and went around the house to my car. I made it inside and started the engine. I stared at the house one more time. Nobody followed me. I saw the front door open again, and the two men from inside stood behind the storm door and just seemed to stare me down. I gave them the finger and drove off halfway down the road before calling the cops. I stayed nearby until I saw the cops pull up to the house. The two men, or however many people were in that house, were gone. Nobody had actually lived in that house for years. I went home feeling angry and disturbed, but also grateful that I escaped with my life. That night, I got a phone call from an unknown number at like 2 in the morning. I didn't answer, and they didn't leave a voicemail. 10 seconds later, I got a text from the same number saying, "Look outside your window." I had my blinds down and feared what might be on the other side, but I had a pretty good feeling. I called the cops yet again, letting the person outside know that I was as well. They arrived in a surprising 3 minutes and began to search the whole premises. They found him hiding in my bush outside my window. He was arrested. His name is Tony Schelling. He was, in fact, the same person I met at the house. My message to all is to not be an idiot while using websites like Craigslist. Number 3. I'm a 22-year-old girl. I was looking on Craigslist to buy a couch for my new apartment a month ago. I found something I thought seemed like a good deal. From the pictures, the couch seemed to be in great shape. The seller wanted to be contacted by email. His email was mexicanpoppy666@hotmail.com. I felt that email was a bit off-putting, but I still went ahead and emailed the man my offer. He responded within 5 minutes, accepting the offer and asking for my address. I honestly felt uncomfortable with his asking. I did not want a stranger coming to my house. I suggested that I just come to his house to pick it up, but he continually insisted that he come to my house. Eventually I stopped responding, and a day later, he emailed me again, giving me his address. I didn't know if I should go at that point, but it seemed like a steal, almost too good to be true, and according to his address, he didn't live too far. So I got in my van and drove over to the seller's house. I immediately noticed that the house was a bit smaller than all the other houses on the block. When I rang the bell, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap answered the door. He gave me a huge smile and invited me in. I was immediately feeling uneasy. He led me into his living room, and I saw the couch. Immediately, I saw scuff marks and small tears in the couch. It was not at all in the shape that it appeared in the ad. I commented on this, and he just smiled and offered to lower the price. I told him I'm not interested, and here's where things started getting creepy. As I was making my way out of the house, he put his hand on my shoulder and offered to give it to me for free if I was willing to, quote-unquote, give something to him. I let out a disgusted gasp and got back into my car. I didn't even look up out the window. I just drove away from there quickly. But it doesn't end there. That same night, I was laying in my bed watching TV when I thought I heard somebody stomping up the steps of my porch. I muted the TV and was able to clearly hear the sound of somebody fiddling with my front doorknob. I jumped out of my bed and tiptoed over to the front door to look through the peephole, but whoever it was already gone. And then, I thought I could hear the sound of the gate to the backyard opening and closing. That was when I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Soon after, I heard the sound of somebody fiddling with the doorknob to the back door of the apartment. I yelled to whoever it was that the police were on their way, and after that, I heard the sound of the gate opening and closing again. They were gone. This was a month ago and nothing has happened since, but I still can't sleep at night. I'm 99% sure it was the man that was selling the couch. He must have followed me home. There was no way it was just a coincidence. I don't plan on using Craigslist anymore, and I'm still trying to find a new apartment. Number 2. I was looking for a car to buy for my son for his 18th birthday. I was searching all the typical car websites, cars.com, eBay Motors. They were all overpriced as expected. Craigslist was the only place to find an actual deal. About a week into my search, I found an 03 Toyota Camry. It had 67,000 miles, no accidents, no damage, and good condition for only $3,500. This seemed like a steal for such a reliable car with such low mileage. The seller lived about 10 miles from me, which was a reasonable drive when looking for a car. I gave him a call to set up a time to come check it out. The man sounded normal on the phone. He assured me that there were absolutely no problems with the car. He introduced himself as Bob. I brought along $3,500 in cash, even though I planned on wiggling down the price as much as possible. I pulled up the dirt road to Bob's property about 15 minutes early. It was a tiny little house with a decent-sized property, only because it was a bit far from the nearest neighbors. The garage was open, so I walked over to see if anybody was inside, but except for an unusual amount of car parts, it was empty. The car was nowhere in sight. The only car on the property was an old pickup truck. I went over to the front door to check the house numbers. It was the right address. The doorbell button was missing, so I knocked on the front door. I knocked for exactly 5 minutes before deciding to give the man a call. So I dialed his number and I heard the sound of a cell phone ringing from inside the house. I was extremely confused at this point. Now I knew I had the right house. I didn't understand why, if he was home, why he wasn't answering. I decided I had to take a peek through one of the windows to see if anybody was inside. Peering through the glass, I couldn't really see much as it was pretty dark inside the house. I saw a very old-fashioned dining room set, but across from that, I saw somebody standing at the back door of the house, staring outside. I figured that must have been Bob, so I knocked on the window, but he didn't even move. There was no gate or anything to the backyard. It was just a wide open yard since this wasn't a rural area. I simply walked around the house to the backyard. I didn't understand how he couldn't hear me. When I got to the back door, I made a shocking realization. The figure standing by the door was a taxidermied human being. I ran straight back the way I came and back to my car. I looked up one last time before driving off. The blinds to the window I had peeked into had been shut, but I could see 2 of the blinds bent open. Somebody was at that window watching me. You can probably guess I had the gas pedal to the floor the whole way home. The whole situation still makes no sense. All the car parts, the fact that there was no Toyota Camry, the taxidermied human being, the fact that there was no car there leads me to believe that whoever that man wasn't planning on selling me anything. And that also leads to the disturbing thought that I was very close to becoming a lifeless statue staring out that man's back door. Number 1. I was looking to buy the iPhone 5 about a year ago. I found a guy on Craigslist who was selling his for $200. He claimed it was in mint condition and that he wanted to upgrade to the 5C. I didn't know much about how to go about testing a phone to make sure everything works, so I brought my little brother along who knew a lot more than I did. We met halfway at a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot at like 10 o'clock at night. 2 large, intimidating guys stepped out of a black Honda Civic and walked over to us. One of the guys pulled out the phone and showed it to me. It didn't have a scratch on it. My brother took out my SIM card and popped it into this new phone. He did some testing and told me that it works. The guy then asked for $250, even though he originally asked for $200. I lied and told him I only brought $200, and he seemed a bit unhappy with this. I did have $250, but I didn't want to spend more than his original asking price. I kind of figured it was his way of making sure I didn't haggle down the price. I handed the guy the $200, and he and his buddy got back in their car. We got back into my car and I tested out the new phone by calling my girlfriend. I sat testing things around for about 5 minutes. My brother commented on the fact that the two guys hadn't left yet either, but I didn't really care. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. My brother then commented that the two guys started their car just as I had. I didn't find it too weird. I drove down the turnpike and eventually stopped at a red light. That's when I noticed the black Honda Civic pull up right behind us in my rear view mirror. I found that a bit weird since I was sure they came from the opposite direction. I continued my drive home, but every single turn we made, they followed, and close on my tail too. My brother suggested I pull over, but there was no way I was going to do that. I knew those guys were looking for trouble. It got to the point where I was trying to lose them and started driving dangerously. If they needed something, they would call or at least honk their horn, but they were looking for some kind of trouble. I tried something risky to lose them. At an intersection, the light had just turned red. I floored it across the intersection before any of the cars would begin to pass. My brother shouted at me, calling me stupid and crazy, but it worked. They didn't follow. We got home after the extra long drive. My heart was still racing from the intensity of the situation. I was just happy I got a working phone for such a low cost. Later that night, I was playing around with the phone trying to set some things up before going to bed. My parents and brother were already asleep at this point, and just then, the sound of 2 car doors slamming shut outside interrupted me. I looked out my window, and I felt like my heart completely stopped. The black Honda Civic was parked across the street. I could only assume the 2 guys were already halfway to our front door. I immediately woke up my dad and explained everything as quickly as possible. He got up, grabbed a baseball bat, and crouched behind the front door. A loud knock came at the front door. My dad screamed at them to go away. One of the guys on the other side of the door claimed to have a gun, and said that he would shoot the lock off of the door if he didn't open up. My dad told me to call Joe, our friend who lives 2 doors down who happens to be a police officer. I called Joe and he said he would be right over and to stay hidden. Here's the part that still scares me to this day. There was the sound of a silenced shot of a pistol. I peeked over and saw a bullet hole in the door, inches away from my dad's head. My dad ran away from the door and we all listened. We heard Joe outside yelling at them to drop their weapons. My dad went outside to help when they lowered their guns. Joe arrested the 2 assholes. I have to say, this was the scariest day of my life, but it was also the best I had ever felt in my entire life. This is a popular story with my family and most of my friends. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment and moving out of her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move together since they'd only been dating for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like, "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most of the other places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable with living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she received an email back with all the details and time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by at 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there's a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkempt. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens the door. At first, Amanda thinks that she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and that he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off but aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. No furniture. Nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping the lights on for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walked down the hall into the living room, she notices the front door has a plank nailed across it. Quote-unquote broken for sure. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, but trying to be polite. As she's given the guy her "thanks for the showing" bit, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. He claims it's recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in the small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs, and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda gets a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah, are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It's great, you have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out of the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. Cops were called. They took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been removed. The house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier. It was found out that the house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room that the so-called landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gallon jugs everywhere. More creepy was he had plastered ripped up pages from porno magazines on all the walls in the room. The really scary part of this was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty except another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of assorted tape. I was up late looking for goalie equipment on Craigslist some night in the summer. I was only 14 and had no job and therefore no money, so I had to find the cheapest deal possible. I didn't really care about the condition of anything. I came across an ad that seemed like a steal. The pictures showed the pads, blocker, glove, and stick. They were all in visibly good condition. It was only listed for $50. That seemed like an insane deal. I contacted the seller via text and he asked me a few questions, one of which was how old I am. I responded 14 and he told me he's glad to hear that I'm dedicated at a young age. It didn't really seem weird to me what he said at the time, but now that I look back on it, I should have been wiser. I asked the seller for his address, but he instead asked me what town I'm from and that he could just meet me somewhere walking distance from my house. I didn't know how I felt about this, but I really wanted that equipment. We agreed to meet in the parking lot of the mall, which is literally down the block from my house. I stood alone in the exact spot I described for a few minutes, until I heard somebody toot their horn. I noticed a white van parked away from all the other cars, and then I received a text saying that he was in the white van. I replied telling him to come out with the equipment, but he said it would be easier to do the transaction in the van. I had a really bad feeling about this and hightailed away from there. I ran down the block, and when I looked back, I saw the white van driving down the street behind me. Now there was someone in the passenger side as well. I didn't want to lead them to my house, so I cut into some random person's backyard and hopped over the fence. I was on the opposite side of the block now, hiding behind a bush. Within 20 seconds, the white van passed by and turned the next turn, vanishing from sight. It was safe to run back to my house now. My parents flipped shit on me when I told them about it. I didn't get the tag number or a good look at their faces, so all they could report was a suspicious white van. The Craigslist ad was taken down, so I couldn't show it to my parents. I thought it was over, but that night, I heard a vehicle engine running outside. I looked out my window down to the street and saw the white van sitting across the street, but as soon as I looked out the window, the van drove off down the road out of sight. I haven't seen it since. I don't know if they saw me or not, or if they somehow found my address. It makes me paranoid to this day. I was selling a dining room set on Craigslist. I listed it for $1,200, but put slightly negotiable in the title. It was a good-looking set, but I wasn't getting any offers. I did live in the country though, so not a lot of people lived in my town. I finally received a call about the set. The man on the other end of the phone had a very shaky voice, and he sounded a bit off, but I can't really explain how. He wanted to check out the set to make an offer, so I gave him my address, and he said he would be over within the hour. I dusted off all the furniture one more time to make it look as nice as possible. The doorbell rang within 10 minutes. I was shocked. He must have lived really close, which in my area was very surprising. I opened the door and immediately felt uncomfortable about letting this man into my house. He was wearing a white undershirt with yellow stains scattered all over it. His pants were way too baggy and had a few tears in them. His gray mustache stained brown in the middle, and his hair a complete mess. Basically everything you shouldn't look in public, he looked. Basically everything you shouldn't look in public, he looked. He greeted me with a hello in the same shaky voice as before. I invited him in and he immediately caught a glimpse of the dining room set, since the dining room is the first room you see in the house. He began walking around really slowly, making weird sounds and making sure to feel every inch of every piece of furniture. I was very weirded out watching this and decided to break the silence by bringing up the price. I reminded him that my asking price was $1,200, and then he stopped, looked up at me, and gave me the most unnerving smile I had ever seen. "How about $500? He asked me. I laughed a bit at the insane offer, almost thinking he was joking, but when his smile turned to an angry expression, I knew he wasn't. I apologized and told him that's much too low for me. The lowest I would be willing to go is $1,000. The man then started acting even weirder. He put his hands up to his head and started making strange noises again, pacing back and forth. He then looked at me with a look of anger and hatred. This man was not right in the head. I realized it just then and there, and I needed him out of my house. I apologized to him again and thanked him for coming, which was the most obvious way of me letting him know it was time for him to leave. But he didn't move. At this point, the stare he was giving me was obviously a stare of malice. This man was much bigger than me, and I didn't think I could take him in a fight. But then the man moved his hand to his back pocket, and I quickly assumed he was reaching for a gun. I ran upstairs to my bedroom to my closet, leaving the man alone in the dining room. In my closet, I grabbed my .45, loaded it, and took cover behind the wall, sneaking a peek into the dining room. The man was gone. I went back to my room and locked the door. I called the police and took cover behind my bed in the meantime. It felt like hours before I heard the police sirens outside my house. However, I stayed put behind my bed. For all I knew, that man was right outside my bedroom door. Thankfully, I hadn't locked the door, and I heard the police enter my house. I left the bedroom with my hands raised and showed them my ID. They had me wait outside while they continued their search. I sat there for probably 5 minutes before the 2 police officers stepped out of my house, with the man in handcuffs. They told me something disturbing. He was hiding in my pantry closet with a loaded gun. I feel it's only a miracle that the police weren't shot at. But the thing that still haunts me the most to this day was the look that man gave me through the window of the police car as it drove off. A look of malice and hatred, like the first thing he would plan to do after getting out of jail would be to come back for me. I'm still thinking about moving. I can't deal with the constant paranoia of that man coming back. All I can say that can be learned from this is to be very careful when giving your address to people from Craigslist. I'm ashamed to admit that my life at one point was so pathetic that I had to resort to using the men seeking women and one-night stand sections of Craigslist, specifically when I was 28. As you'd expect, most of the posts seemed fake or contained images of really fat, gross, or just undesirable women. That is, except for one. There was a posting with a picture of a cute brunette woman saying on the listing, female 26, looking for a quick hookup. No feelings, no relationships, just one night stand. The thing about this photo was that it wasn't a picture of some insanely smoking hot chick. It was just a normal, decent looking woman making the whole thing more realistic and believable. She left her number on the bottom. I texted her and immediately noticed that she had an iPhone since my iMessage sent a blue bubble. Within seconds, the little gray bubble with the 3 periods popped up, informing me that she was typing. She replied with, "Hi, I'm Jen, but you can call me Jenny." I started to kind of flirt around with her until she gave me her address. As I grabbed my car keys, I didn't know if I should feel excited or ashamed. Minutes later, I arrived to the relatively unlit dead-end block in a rather unappealing area. Second thoughts were popping up now. I shot her a text asking which house she was in. She responded 209, the last house by the dead end. I pulled up to the last house on the street, and sure enough, the little porch light revealed the number 209 stamped onto the house. I'm not gonna lie, it was a shitty looking house. Tiny, single floor, tall grass, and whatnot. I was really doing this. I got out of my car and knocked on her door. There was no answer. Suddenly my phone vibrated. Jenny texted me, telling me to come around back. Why? I asked. The gray bubble indicating she was typing something popped up, then went away. I waited for her to type something, but she didn't. I was a desperate, pathetic man, so against my better judgment, I made my way over to the wooden gate and latched it open. I walked very slowly into the opening of the backyard and froze. I looked up at the windows of the dark house, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw someone staring down at me from one of the top windows. The moment they noticed me, they moved away, and the blinds closed. It must have been Jenny, I was thinking to myself. My phone vibrated. She texted me saying, "I'll be right out, just brushing up." I was shaking now. I don't know if it was because I was nervous about hooking up with a woman for the first time in over a year, or if I was nervous about the weirdness of the situation. I could swear I suddenly heard a stick or something crack from further in the yard. Curiously, I flipped on the flashlight on my iPhone and aimed it over to that corner of the yard. My heart must have flat out stopped for a few moments when I saw what I could swear was an arm moving behind the wooden shed in the corner. I turned off the flashlight and somehow silently left the yard and got back in my car. Before I could shut the door, I heard a window from the house slam open, and a deranged, lunatic-sounding woman who I couldn't see screamed, "Wait, don't go." When I was pulling away from the house, the front door opened, and I heard a loud pop sound. I floored it away from there, and about 5 blocks up, I pulled over and realized I had a flat. They had shot my tire. I tried to get the car as far away from this town as possible before calling roadside service to set up my spare tire. The repair guy found the bullet still in the flat tire. He believed my story and did me a favor of vouching for me in front of a cop. There were 3 people who were arrested. one filthy-looking woman and two redneck-looking men. They stood trial and were found guilty of God knows what, I don't remember. It's funny, they were too stupid to even evacuate the house after pulling something like that. My mother and stepdad are ranchers. They got a new work truck and put the old one up for sale. A lady from another rural area about 4 hours away was super interested, but gave numerous reasons why she could not even drive halfway to get the truck. My stepdad is nice to a fault, so he convinced my mother to follow in a second vehicle that Saturday so he could drive the truck there. My mom's no fool, and this lady was already making her suspicious. Well, her feelings weren't helped when we arrived and the lady gave a convoluted story about bank problems and presented a post-dated check. She also begged my stepdad to leave the plates in his name. My mom excused herself, grabbed my stepdad, and had a heated argument about taking the check and the plates. She won on canceling the plates, but she lost on the check. So they drove another 4 hours home, and as anyone not my stepdad guessed, the check bounced when it came to the date it was written. The woman dodged phone calls for a while, eventually answering and giving another convoluted story about being in the hospital and on and on. My stepdad for once stood his ground and told her they'd be taking back the truck. So they drove another 4 hours there, this time with a flatbed in case parts were missing or something. No one answered the door at the property, and they found the truck in the shed and loaded it up. My stepdad had tried to keep my mom from saying what was on her mind, but while he was busy securing the load, she wrote something to the effect of, "Thanks for nothing, hope you enjoyed fucking us around," and slipped it under the door. 15 minutes later, as they're driving home, the cell phone rings, and the lady who was supposedly hospitalized was on the line. She said she knows exactly where they lived and that they made a huge mistake. 2 days later, my stepdad awoke to someone climbing into the house through his bedroom window. I heard my mother's screams all the way from my bedroom, which was one of the most chilling moments of my life. It was the crazed woman breaking in, armed with a knife. I don't know how, but my stepdad managed to take her down even while she was armed. The whole story was shared with police, and then the woman was taken away. I guess karma is a pretty amazing thing. This story took place a long time ago, back in 2002, when Craigslist was in its early years. Many wouldn't know, but back in those days, Craigslist was a lot different. It was a lot more so an online garage sale, or just a place where people would list old things that still had some value that they were willing to give away. I got a basketball hoop, a hockey net, and a spoiler for my car, all free in perfect condition in that same year. You'd be lucky if you found something like that these days. Anyway, me and my son were dying to buy a hockey net so we could practice in the cul-de-sac we lived in. For the record, this was before I got that free one I mentioned. Wouldn't you know it, on Craigslist there was an ad for a slightly used regulation-size hockey goal for only $50. It came with a puck and 2 slightly used hockey sticks. I still have a picture of that ad to this day. It seemed like the perfect deal, but he lived about 2 hours away. I called the number he had listed, and he sounded pretty normal on the phone. He had a pretty deep, dark voice, but nothing that would be off-putting. I remember his voice being a bit emotionless. He agreed to meet halfway due to the distance, said he'd put the stuff in the back of his pickup truck. He said he could only come after he got off from work though, which was much later in the day, way past dark. We agreed to meet at some rest stop off the highway. Me and my son, who was 11 at the time, took my wife's minivan, the only car that would be able to fit that huge thing. Within an hour, we were at the truck stop, which was empty at this hour, but was decently lit by 3 big light posts. I parked right under one of the lights and waited. A pickup truck pulled in off the highway right on time. He stopped right in front of me. I went over to his window, but then noticed there was nothing in the back of his truck. "You Steve?" he asked me. "Yep, that's me," I said. "Alright, my buddy's bringing in the stuff with his truck." The guy pulled up behind my car and put it in park. I suddenly had a bad feeling. I told my son to get back in the car and lock every door except mine. 2 more pairs of headlights came off the highway into the lots, surely enough pulling up next to me. And, not surprisingly at this point, there was no hockey equipment in either one of them. My heart was racing. I was worried. Not for me, but for my young son who I for some reason brought with me on this trip. A group of large men mixed with heavy-set and muscular physiques stepped out of the 2 pickup trucks behind the first one. They eyed me from head to toe, giving that typical intimidation stare down. Then this bald guy wearing sunglasses said in a deep voice, "Where's the money?" I instantly pulled out my wallet and handed it to him, begging him to just let me and my son go. He pulled out like $100 and was pissed, expecting more. He then sent 2 of his goons or whatever to get my son. At this point, I screamed and begged for him not to take him. One of the men broke the glass to the minivan back door, and I vividly remember the disturbing, heartbreaking screams of my young son. What happened next was what I can only explain to be a miracle from God answering my prayers. A car was entering the lot from off the highway. All the men stopped and turned to look at it. As it got closer, my heart literally dropped in excitement as I saw it was a police car. The lights suddenly began to flash as he got close enough to see what was going on. All of the men were back in their trucks within seconds, speeding off down the highway. Well, at least 2 of them. The truck in the back was caught immediately by the police car, and backup arrived shortly. I explained everything to them, and they got the men that were caught to rat out on the others surprisingly quickly. I guess luckily the guys in the back truck weren't very loyal to whoever their leader was, if they even had any type of leader. Believe it or not, I had a police escort all the way home to make me and my son feel safer. I don't want to get into all the legal stuff, but I'll just say that all of those men except for one was caught, and I'm pretty sure that was the driver of the first pickup truck. Needless to say, my Craigslist days weren't over at that point, but I have always been much more protective of my son and much more cautious of Craigslist meetings since then.